The most revealing thing Lady Sarah Chatto ever did was not a speech. It was a retreat. In a family trained to smile through almost anything, Sarah learned very early that the quietest person in the room could see the most. She was born into satin, tiaras, footmen, nursery tea, and a surname that sounded as if it came wrapped in tissue paper. Yet the great lesson of her childhood was not grandeur. It was distance. Distance from noise. Distance from performance. Distance, eventually, from the brilliant, wounded, impossible mother who filled every doorway and somehow left every room feeling empty. Before Sarah could walk away from Princess Margaret had to become the sort of woman people either worshipped, pitied, or survived. Margaret Rose was born in 1930, the second daughter of the Duke and Duchess of York, at a time when nobody expected her father to become king. Her older sister Elizabeth was the careful child, dutiful even before anyone handed her a duty. Margaret was the spark. She was small, pretty, sharp, and gifted with the dangerous knowledge that adults laughed when she said things others were too polite to say. In another family, this might have been called personality. In the royal family, it was treated like a small fire near valuable curtains. Then history moved the furniture. In 1936, King Edward gave up the throne to marry Wallis Simpson, and Margaret's shy father became King George VI. Elizabeth became the future queen. Margaret became the spare daughter in a monarchy that had suddenly learned how terrifying personal desire could be. The family never forgot the lesson. Love, if mishandled, could shake the crown. A woman could be charming at dinner, but if she chose the wrong person, the Archbishop, the Prime Minister, and every newspaper editor in London might suddenly develop opinions about her heart. For Margaret, this was not theory. It became her life. After the war, she fell in love with Group Captain Peter Townsend, a decorated war hero who served in the royal household. He was handsome, steady, and inconvenient in the precise way that royal families dread. He was divorced. He had children. He was not wicked, which made the matter worse, because there was no easy villain to blame. Margaret loved him, and the public sensed a romance. The palace sensed a problem. In the years after the abdication, nobody wanted another royal story in which love stood across the room from duty and asked everyone to choose sides. Margaret was told to wait. Waiting is easy to recommend when someone else is doing it. By 1955, after years of pressure, delay, and careful wording from men in dark suits, Margaret announced that she would not marry Townsend. The statement was dignified. It was also the sound of a door closing on one version of her life. The public saw sacrifice. The family saw relief. Margaret saw something more private. Her sister had the throne, her mother had the memory of a beloved husband, and she had been asked to surrender the one future that was entirely hers. After that, Margaret became more dazzling and less reachable. She smoked with theatrical calm. She arrived late with the confidence of a person who knew everybody would wait. She loved parties, music, clever men, and the small power of making a room revolve around her. She was not merely royal, she was modern, or at least royal modern, which meant she could scandalize a drawing room without actually leaving it. Then Anthony Armstrong-Jones entered the frame. Tony was not born to the throne, which was part of his appeal. He was a photographer, an artist, a man with a camera, a motorbike, a private language of studios and shadows. He had charm, confidence, and the slightly wicked advantage of not seeming overawed by a princess. Royal men often treated Margaret as either an ornament or a constitutional hazard. Tony treated her as a woman who could be looked at, arranged, teased, desired, and challenged. For Margaret, used to being guarded by protocol, this felt like oxygen with a cigarette in it. He was clever. She was clever. He was vain. She was royal. He liked rooms where people noticed him. She had been born into them. They were not opposites. That was the trouble. They were competing performances in the same theatre. Their engagement was announced in February 1960. It came not long after Peter Townsend revealed he would marry someone else. The timing was noted because in royal life even heartbreak is expected to keep a tidy diary. Tony gave Margaret a ruby and diamond ring shaped like a rosebud. a pretty little symbol for a woman named Rose who had already learned that flowers are often cut before they are admired. On May 6, 1960, they married at Westminster Abbey. It was the first royal wedding broadcast on television, and millions watched a princess marry a commoner, though calling Tony commoner made the word work very hard indeed. He came with talent, connections, ambition, and enough social confidence to fill several country houses. Margaret wore the Baltimore tiara which she had bought herself, a choice that said a great deal about her. She could have borrowed from the royal vaults. Instead, she arrived glittering in something that was hers. A tiara, yes, but also a declaration. If the family had denied her one life, she would stage another under a blaze of diamonds. The marriage began with glamour. Kensington Palace became less a home than a lantern. Artists, actors, writers, aristocrats, and beautiful people passed through. The air smelled of smoke, perfume, flowers, and the faint exhaustion of staff trying to keep up with people who thought breakfast was negotiable. Margaret loved elegance, but she also loved hierarchy. Tony loved talent, but he also loved freedom. Both loved admiration. Neither was naturally built for taking second place over breakfast. Still, for a time, the arrangement worked, or looked as if it did. In 1961, their son David was born. Tony was made Earl of Snowdon that year, giving the photographer a title and the princess a husband who now fit more neatly into court circulars. David was heir to that new title, the little Viscount Linley, born into a world where furniture, art and rank would eventually become his inheritance in more ways than one. Then, on May 1st, 1964, at Kensington Palace, Sarah Frances Elizabeth Armstrong Jones arrived. She was the second child, the only daughter, seventh in line to the throne at birth, and a baby born into a marriage already beginning to cool at the edges. The public saw a charming royal family, princess, photographer husband, little son, new baby daughter. Inside, the truth was more complicated. The Snowdon marriage had the outer shape of success and the inner climate of a room where someone had opened a window in winter. Sarah came into a household where style was abundant and stability was rationed. Her mother was Princess Margaret, Countess of Snowdon, sister of the Queen, a woman who could command a room with a glance and bruise it with a sentence. Her father was Lord Snowdon, one of the most fashionable photographers in Britain, a man who understood angles, light and image better than most husbands, understand silence. Between them stood two children, David and Sarah, who would learn the difference between public beauty and private weather. Kensington Palace is often imagined as one grand house, but it is really a world of apartments, corridors, staircases, bells, staff entrances, family history, and carefully managed proximity. One branch of the family might be laughing in one set of rooms while another nursed a grievance 2 doors away. It was a palace, yes, but also a block of royal flats with better silver. Children could grow up there with cousins nearby, nannies in command, footmen appearing as if conjured, and the knowledge that outside the gates, cameras waited for proof of happiness. Sarah and David grew up in apartment 10, with a nursery life that still belonged partly to the old world. There was a nanny, Verona Sumner, who helped provide the routine children need when adults are busy being fascinating. There were rules, meals, clothes, lessons, toys, and the quiet choreography of servants who knew when to enter and when to vanish. A royal nursery could be warm. It could also be lonely. Everything depended on the adults orbiting it. Tony, for all his flaws, brought something unusual into his children's lives. He encouraged making things. He liked design, tools, craft, and the satisfaction of transforming raw material into something useful or beautiful. He was not merely a society photographer with famous sitters. He had an eye for structure, for how objects worked, for the dignity of practical skill. With David and Sarah, that mattered. David would later become a furniture maker. Sarah would become a painter. The seeds were planted early, not in speeches about artistic destiny, but in the permission to look closely and use one's hands. For Sarah, this was more than a hobby. It was an escape route before she knew she needed one. Painting teaches a child to pay attention without demanding that she perform. A flower, a table, a window, a stretch of land does not ask whether you are royal enough. It simply waits to be seen. For a girl born into a family where every expression could be read as a message, art offered another language. It had rules, but not palace rules. It had discipline, but not the discipline of curtsies and precedents. It was quiet work, and quiet would become Sarah's chosen kingdom. Margaret, by contrast, lived through intensity. She adored beauty, music, ballet, jewels, clothes, and the ritual of being treated as someone rare. She could be generous, funny, loyal, and magnetic. She could also be cutting, imperious, and difficult to please. Those who loved her often had to develop strong nerves and a memory short enough to survive lunch. She had been hurt, and the hurt did not make her softer. It made her more determined never to be treated as ordinary. Motherhood did not remove this. It had to fit around it. In the royal world of the 1960s, nobody expected titled parents to behave like modern hands on mothers and fathers in denim, attending every school event with homemade biscuits. Children had nannies, adults had duties, dinners, tours, charities, houses, friends, lovers, and moods. The system was designed to keep children safe, polished, and presentable, not necessarily emotionally fluent. Yet even within that world, children understand the temperature of a home. They know when a room is safe. They know when laughter has an edge. They know when a parent is coming closer, and when everyone is bracing. Sarah learned in a house where glamour and tension sat together like guests who had not been properly introduced. The Snowdons were photographed as modern royals, more stylish than stiff, more artistic than conventional. Tony took pictures of the famous and became famous himself. Margaret moved through society with the confidence of a woman who had never needed to ask for a table. They belonged to the fashionable London of the 1960s, when old rank and new celebrity began eyeing each other across dinner parties and deciding the arrangement might be useful. Margaret could bring royalty to Bohemia. Tony could bring Bohemia to royalty. The result looked thrilling in newspapers and exhausting at home. Money, too, had its quiet role. Margaret had royal status, grace and favour homes, jewels, staff, and access to a life that most people could not imagine. Tony had a career, a title after marriage, and his own income and ambitions. Yet money in such families is rarely just money. It is leverage, independence, pride, and sometimes insult. Who paid for what? Who owned what? Who had earned what? And who had been given what could lie beneath ordinary conversations like a blade under a napkin? Margaret had been born royal. Tony had made himself fashionable. Each could look down on the other from a different balcony. As the decade moved on, the marriage became less a romance than a contest conducted in public smiles and private absences. Tony worked, Margaret entertained. Both were drawn to admiration elsewhere. Both could wound. There were reports of affairs, resentments, sharp notes, and humiliations. Some stories grew in the telling, as royal stories do, but the central truth did not need embroidery. The marriage was not peaceful. Children do not need every detail to understand a storm. They feel the pressure change. Sarah was still small when the atmosphere around her parents began to harden. David, older and heir to his father's title, occupied one place in the family drama. Sarah, the daughter, occupied another. She was close enough to her mother to be shaped by her, but different enough to resist becoming her. Margaret wanted love, loyalty, and attention. Sarah would learn to give love without surrendering her entire self, which is a delicate skill in any family and practically needlework in a royal one. There was another woman in Sarah's life who mattered deeply, her aunt, Queen Elizabeth. To the public, the Queen was sovereign, distant by necessity, formal by training. To Sarah, she was also family. Elizabeth understood discipline in a way Margaret never entirely accepted. The Queen had built her adult life around containment. She did not display every feeling. She did not turn every disappointment into theatre. This could make her seem remote, but to a child raised near volatility, steadiness can feel like affection. The Queen did not need to dazzle Sarah. She offered something rarer in that family, a centre that held. Sarah was one of the few people who could see the Queen not only as a monarch, but as an aunt who knew what it meant to live beside Margaret. Elizabeth loved her sister, but love did not blind her. She knew Margaret could be both enchanting and exhausting. She had watched her sparkle, suffer, rebel, and retreat. She had protected her when she could and contained her when she must. Between the sisters lay a lifetime of tenderness, rivalry, duty, and small injuries wrapped in impeccable manners. Sarah was born into the aftermath of all of it. This mattered because Sarah's later quietness was not emptiness. It was inheritance filtered through choice. She saw the cost of making drama one's natural climate. She saw the cost of being trapped between desire and duty. She saw a mother who had been denied, indulged, adored, criticized, and never fully satisfied. She saw an aunt who carried duty like a heavy coat and rarely complained about the weather. Between these two royal sisters, Sarah found her own answer: do the minimum required in public, protect the private life, and never confuse attention with peace. But in the early years, none of that was yet a decision. It was only a child's instinct. At Kensington Palace, Sarah could move between worlds. There was the polished world of royal occasions, where clothes were chosen, names were announced, and every adult seemed to know exactly where to stand. There was the artistic world of her father, full of cameras, studios, prints, and people who spoke of composition rather than precedence. There was the emotional world of her mother, rich in affection one day and frost the next. And there was the larger royal world, presided over by the Queen, where personal trouble was never allowed to disturb the public face for long. The crown had survived abdication, war, and scandal. It was not going to be brought down by a bad marriage in apartment 10, though it might make life miserable for those inside it. Sarah's position was unusual. She was royal, but not royal enough to be trapped at the very center. She was close to the throne, but not destined for it. She had rank, but not a role carved in stone. This could have become a frustration. For Sarah, it became a gift. Being slightly to the side allowed her to watch. It also allowed her eventually to step further away. Princess Margaret did not step away from anything quietly. She had been trained to enter, to sit, to be seen, to receive, to command. Even her unhappiness had presence. If she was wounded, the wound expected good service. Yet her daughter developed in the opposite direction. Sarah did not appear to crave the royal spotlight. She did not cultivate scandal. She did not use her mother's notoriety as a ladder. In a family where some people seemed born with a small orchestra following them, Sarah chose the nearest exit and closed the door softly behind her. That choice would take years to become visible. First, the child had to grow up inside the story. By the late 1960s, the Snowdon marriage was visibly strained to those who knew them. The parties continued, the photographs continued. The manners continued because British upper-class manners can continue through almost anything short of actual flames. But the marriage itself was fraying. Margaret, still beautiful and still formidable, disliked being ignored. Tony, restless and sharp, disliked being possessed. Each had entered the marriage wanting freedom from a different cage. Somehow they built a new cage together and decorated it extremely well. The family still gathered. There were holidays, royal events, birthdays and formal appearances. There were trips to Balmoral where the royal family lived by a different rhythm. Dogs, picnics, tweeds, stalking, fishing, and the sort of fresh air that has ruined many a London hairstyle. For Sarah, Balmoral and Sandringham offered contact with the wider family, especially the Queen, whose style of affection was not showy but consistent. In the royal family, consistency is not a small thing. It can be the difference between feeling loved and feeling managed. Margaret had her own refuge. Mystique, the private Caribbean island where she would later build Les Jolies Eaux, a villa given to her as land by her friend Colin Tennant. Mystique would become central to her legend, a place of sun, swimsuits, cocktails, privacy, and very public rumours. But before that world fully took hold, the pattern was already forming. Margaret needed escape. Tony needed escape. The children needed something else entirely. a home that did not keep changing shape around adult appetites. Sarah's childhood was not a misery. That would be too simple, and simple is rarely accurate in royal families. She had privilege beyond measure. She had beauty around her, access, education, travel, art, and the protection of a famous name. She also had parents whose marriage turned affection into a battlefield. Children in such homes often become performers, rebels, fixers, or ghosts. Sarah became an observer. That was the beginning of the walk-away. Not a dramatic exit, not a slammed door, not a cruel rejection of her mother. It began as a child's movement toward steadiness, toward paint and paper, toward the aunt who did not erupt, toward the brother who understood, toward the parts of life that were not constantly being arranged for effect. Princess Margaret had spent her life being looked at. Sarah would spend hers looking closely at other things, and everyone who knew that household could understand why. To understand Sarah's quiet retreat, it helps to see the house she was retreating from. Kensington Palace did not collapse when the Snowdon marriage began to fail. Palaces almost never do the courtesy of showing cracks where ordinary people can see them. The curtains were still drawn at the proper time. The servants still moved with trays. The invitations still arrived. Princess Margaret still dressed as if the world had personally requested her appearance. Lord Snowdon still had work, charm, famous friends, and the kind of restless intelligence that made stillness look like a punishment. Yet inside apartment 10, the children were growing old enough to notice that the performance had begun to cost too much. Sarah was not a baby anymore. She was a little girl with watchful eyes, a soft face, and a temperament that seemed to have arrived from a quieter planet than the one her parents occupied. David, older by 3 years, had already learned that the grown-ups around him were complicated, and that the safest response was often not to ask the obvious question. Sarah learned the same lesson early. In a home like theirs, the obvious question was usually the one nobody wanted answered at breakfast. The world outside still saw glamour. In the late 1960s and early 1970s, Princess Margaret remained one of the most photographed women in Britain, the Queen's sister, the beautiful rebel who had not quite rebelled far enough to be expelled from the family firm. She had a title, jewels, rank, and the permanent fascination of a woman who seemed always to be carrying a private grievance through a public doorway. Newspapers loved her because she gave them contrast. The Queen was discipline. Margaret was drama. The Queen made continuity look almost effortless. Margaret made unhappiness look well-dressed. For Sarah, this contrast was not a newspaper theme. It was family life. Her mother could be enchanting. That must never be forgotten, because difficult people are rarely difficult all the time. If they were, everyone would simply leave earlier. Margaret could be warm, funny, generous, and dazzlingly alive. She loved music and conversation. She had an ear for absurdity and a voice that could make a simple remark sound like a verdict. She enjoyed beauty in the way some people enjoy oxygen. Flowers, clothes, jewels, furniture, paintings, good food, sharp company, all of it mattered to her. She did not want life merely arranged. She wanted it heightened. But heightened life is tiring to live inside when you are a child. Sarah did not seem made for combat. She was not icy. She was not foolish. She was not weak. She simply had no visible appetite for emotional theatre. In a family where silence was often strategy, Sarah's silence would become something different, shelter. She was learning the art of being present without being captured. At school, that instinct found room to breathe. The choice of Bedales mattered. Founded in Hampshire, Bedales had a reputation for being progressive, artistic, and rather less stiff than the sort of schools that seemed designed to turn children into well-varnished furniture. It suited Sarah. There were no footmen in the corridor, no palace bells, no sense that every room contained the echo of an abdication crisis. Bedales valued art, independence, and practical thought. For a girl born close to a throne, that was almost exotic. She could be one child among many, not the daughter of Princess Margaret being gently inspected by people who pretended not to stare. That did not mean she became ordinary. Royal children never become ordinary. They may be treated kindly, even naturally, but there is always someone who remembers exactly who their aunt is. Still, school gave Sarah a small republic of her own. There were classes, friendships, sketches, routines, mistakes not reported in national newspapers, and the deep relief of being judged for something other than bloodline. Art was not a decorative interest for her. It was a method of survival. A pencil does not flatter. Paint does not care whether your mother is a princess. A still life does not ask you to take sides in a marriage. Art rewarded patience, close looking, and discipline, all the things Sarah could control when the adults around her could not seem to control themselves. As Margaret moved increasingly through a world of parties, holidays, admirers, and grievances, Sarah moved toward the calmer authority of form and colour. She was not rejecting beauty. She was choosing the kind that did not shout. Tony understood that part of her. Lord Snowdon, for all the pain he caused Margaret, for all the sharpness and vanity and emotional danger he carried into the marriage, gave his children a real gift. He respected making, not merely collecting, not merely owning, making. In his world, a person shaped an image, a room, a chair, a photograph. His camera was not just a fashionable accessory. It was a way of seeing, controlling, framing, deciding what mattered. David absorbed the importance of structure and craft. Sarah absorbed the importance of looking carefully. Tony was not a simple villain in Sarah's story. He was too alive, too talented, too inconsistent, and too human for that. He could be captivating and cruel, attentive and absent, full of energy one moment and emotionally elsewhere the next. The children saw the charm. They also saw the cost of it. A father who understood art could still fail to provide peace. A mother who loved beauty could still make home feel precarious. Sarah's gift was that she took from each parent what was useful and learned, slowly, what not to inherit. By the early 1970s, Margaret and Tony were living in a state of marriage that polite society could describe at great length without using the plain word unhappy. Their friends knew. The family knew. The staff certainly knew. And staff in royal households have historically known everything while officially knowing almost nothing at all. The children knew in the way children know, from lowered voices, sudden departures, sharp greetings, the particular silence that follows a quarrel, the way adults become very cheerful when they are trying not to be honest. Margaret had always needed admiration. Tony needed independence. These needs did not merely clash, they mocked each other. When Margaret reached for devotion, Tony could resist because he hated being owned. When Tony pursued work, friends, and affairs, Margaret felt humiliated. And humiliation was one thing she could not bear quietly. Her rank had trained her to expect deference. Her life had taught her that deference did not equal love. This made her hunger more painful and her pride more dangerous. The marriage became a drawing-room war with excellent lighting. There were other people, because there are nearly always other people when two glamorous, unhappy adults have too many invitations and too few reasons to go home early. Tony's private life was complicated. Margaret, wounded and furious, did not retreat into mild knitting. She remained socially alive, sharp, and susceptible to attention. She wanted to be desired, not merely respected as the Queen's sister. There is a particular loneliness in being famous for your position while feeling unseen as a person. Margaret knew that loneliness well, and sometimes tried to cure it with company that made the papers worse. The children stood near the edge of it, not at the centre, but close enough. Sarah's adolescence unfolded as her mother's private life became harder to protect. In the old royal style, the first response to trouble was containment. Keep it in the family. Keep it out of the papers. Keep the servants discreet. Keep the smile in place at public events. But Britain was changing. The press was changing. The distance between royalty and public curiosity was shrinking. The old curtain was still there, but people had started tugging at it with enthusiasm. Margaret was especially vulnerable because she had always been more interesting to gossip than the better-behaved members of her family. She was beautiful, temperamental, stylish, and disappointed. She smoked, drank, danced, and went to islands where the rules wore fewer clothes. She was not built for bland respectability. That made her magnetic, and it also made her exposed. Moustique became both refuge and trap. The island was sold to the world as a private paradise, and for a time it truly offered Margaret what Britain did not: heat, freedom, distance, and a circle of friends who treated pleasure as a serious duty. Colin Tennant, later Lord Glenconner, had given Margaret a plot of land there as a wedding present, a gift that sounded romantic until one remembered that even paradise requires maintenance, staffing, and the ability to leave before the mood turns. Margaret built Les Jolies Eaux, a villa whose very name promised pretty waters. It became her escape from court formality, from London scrutiny, from the marriage that had become a duel conducted in increasingly separate rooms. For Margaret, Moustique was not just a holiday home. It was a kingdom small enough to obey her. There she could set the rhythm: swim, lunch, rest, drinks, dinner, music, laughter, late nights. She could be surrounded by friends who knew how to amuse her, flatter her, and forgive her delays because the alternative was not being invited back. Moustique suited the part of Margaret that had never fully accepted that she could not have everything. On the island, for a little while, everything could be rearranged to suit her mood. The sea did not ask her to represent the monarchy. The palm trees did not mention Peter Townsend. The sunset did not care whether Tony came. But children see the other side of adult escape. They see who is left behind. They see who becomes relaxed and who becomes reckless. They notice when a refuge begins to serve the adults more than the family. Sarah would come to know Moustique, of course. It was part of her mother's world. But she never seemed to become a creature of that world in the way Margaret did. Sarah's nature leaned toward steadiness, not display. The island glittered with gossip, and gossip is just conversation that has lost its conscience. It did not suit her as naturally as a studio, a sketchbook, or a quiet walk. Then came Roddy Llewellyn. He was young, handsome, well-connected, and sufficiently charming to make poor judgment look briefly like romance. Margaret met him in the early 1970s, when he was in his 20s and she was in her 40s. The age difference was not a detail anyone overlooked. Society may forgive almost anything when it is having enough fun, but it remembers numbers with the accuracy of a bank clerk. Roddy was not a grand political threat. He was not Peter Townsend, with church and state hovering over the decision. He was something more personally embarrassing for the palace. Visible proof that Princess Margaret wanted affection, attention, and youth around her at a time when her marriage was collapsing. For Margaret, Roddy offered lightness. He was attentive. He made her laugh. He did not arrive carrying the full weight of constitutional anxiety. He was not a husband with grievances or a courtier with warnings. He was company, and company can feel like rescue when home has become a museum of disappointments. But rescue has a way of bringing photographers. In 1976, photographs of Margaret and Roddy on Moustique were published, and the private arrangement became public property. Margaret, the Queen's sister, was seen holidaying with a much younger man while still married to Lord Snowdon. The papers pounced. They did not need to invent much. The story already had everything they liked: royalty, marriage, son, swimwear, age difference, betrayal, and the useful suggestion that the old rules had failed again. For the palace, it was a nightmare in sandals. For Sarah, who was still only a girl, it was something else entirely. Imagine being 12 years old and watching your mother's unhappiness become national entertainment. Imagine knowing enough to be embarrassed, too young to be able to change anything, and too well-bred to say in public what any ordinary child might have shouted in the kitchen. Royal children are often told, directly or indirectly, that their feelings must wait behind the needs of the institution. Sarah learned that lesson not from a textbook, but from headlines. It was not simply that Margaret had taken a lover. Aristocratic Britain had survived many lovers with astonishing stamina. The scandal cut deeper because it made visible what the family had tried to keep arranged. The marriage was finished, the princess was lonely, the husband was elsewhere, and the children were caught inside a story that adults had failed to end cleanly. Everyone had known, but knowing privately and seeing it splashed across the press are different forms of knowledge. One bruises, the other brands. In March 1976, Princess Margaret and Lord Snowdon announced their separation. The wording was controlled, as royal wording always is when life itself has become uncontrollable. But the meaning was plain. The first marriage of a senior royal in the Queen's immediate family had publicly broken apart in modern times. After all the rules, all the sacrifice over Peter Townsend, all the caution after the abdication, Margaret had still arrived at marital disaster. The palace had denied her one controversial marriage, only to watch another, approved and televised, become a slow public wreck. History can be spiteful when it wants to be tidy. The separation did not merely alter Margaret and Tony's social arrangements, it changed the emotional geography of their children's lives. David was entering his teenage years. Sarah was still young enough to need protection, old enough to understand shame. Their parents did not stop being their parents simply because the marriage failed. That is the cruel part for children. Adults may separate, but the child remains made of both of them. To reject one entirely can feel like self-harm. To defend both can become exhausting. To survive, a child often builds a private room inside herself. Sarah's private room grew larger. The royal family closed ranks because that is what it did. The Queen loved Margaret, but she also had a monarchy to protect. The Queen Mother loved Margaret with the indulgence of a parent who had watched her younger daughter suffer, and perhaps never fully knew how to deny her afterward. There were family sympathies, private frustrations, and the unspoken understanding that Margaret had always been difficult, partly because life had been difficult to her. This did not make her behavior easier for her children. It merely made it harder to condemn without feeling cruel. Sarah did not condemn. That was never her style. But she learned distance. There is a difference between walking away in anger and walking away in wisdom. Sarah's later life would suggest the second. As a girl, she could not simply leave her mother's orbit. She still belonged to Kensington Palace, to family holidays, to the royal calendar, to school terms arranged around adult lives. But emotionally, something had begun to shift. She was learning that love did not require constant nearness. She was learning that loyalty did not mean surrendering peace. In a family built on duty, that was almost a radical thought. Margaret, meanwhile, did not become less Margaret because the marriage ended. If anything, separation sharpened the elements already present. She could still be magnificent. She could still be difficult. She could still command loyalty from friends who understood her charm and forgave her storms. She could still make people laugh with a single raised eyebrow. She could also make a room colder than an unfunded castle. Her need for control was not simply arrogance, it came from loss. She had lost the freedom to marry Peter Townsend. She had lost the fantasy that Tony would give her a modern, passionate, equal marriage without humiliating her. She had lost the protection of being merely glamorous. Now she was publicly wounded. To a woman raised in royal dignity, public pity could feel almost obscene. So she leaned into rank, taste, and authority. If life would not obey her, perhaps lunch might. Those around her often paid for this. Staff, friends, lovers, relatives, even her children could be drawn into the weather system of Margaret. A good mood could be splendid. A bad mood required careful navigation and perhaps a small boat. Sarah, by temperament, did not want to spend her life studying the forecast. Tony's role after the separation was equally complicated. He did not vanish. He remained her father, a figure of charm, work, artistic seriousness, and emotional complication. He later remarried, and his life continued with its own scandals and attachments. For David and Sarah, this meant adjusting not only to the break of one household, but to the expansion of adult consequences. There were new loyalties to manage, new arrangements, new rooms in which to behave properly. Children of divorce often become diplomats. Royal children of divorce become diplomats without being allowed to look tired. Sarah became very good at looking composed. This composure was not coldness. People who knew her would later describe her as kind, gentle, and grounded. Those qualities do not appear by accident in a family where drama is available in bulk. They are usually built through refusal to escalate, refusal to compete for attention, refusal to weaponize grievance, refusal to become the loudest person in the room just because the loudest person seems to win the first round. In the late 1970s, Sarah's world still carried privilege most people could barely imagine. She had access to places, education, art, and family connections that opened doors before she touched the handle. Yet privilege does not cancel pain. It gives pain better upholstery. A child can feel lonely under a palace roof. A daughter can feel embarrassed beneath a tiara. A family can dine from fine china while everyone quietly avoids the subject, cracking the table in half. The divorce came in 1978. By then, the separation had already told the truth, but the legal ending gave it final form. Princess Margaret and Lord Snowdon became the first senior royal couple in the Queen's close family to divorce since the old scandals everyone preferred not to discuss unless there was port nearby. It was historic, but not in a way anyone in the family wanted embroidered on a cushion. The monarchy had entered the modern age not through policy or speeches, but through the breakup of a marriage millions had watched begin on television. The children did not need historians to tell them it mattered. They had lived through the evidence. For Sarah, the divorce landed during adolescence, that tender age when a person is already trying to assemble an identity out of nerves, hopes, and borrowed opinions. Her family name made privacy difficult. Her mother's fame made it harder. Margaret was not just any divorced mother. She was Princess Margaret, sister of the Queen, a woman whose every disappointment seemed to confirm some national theory about privilege, rebellion, or the decline of standards. Sarah had to become herself while the world was still arguing about what her mother represented. That pressure could have pushed her toward defiance. It did not. Instead, Sarah deepened into art, school, and a more private rhythm. Bedales allowed her to live in a world where talent and temperament mattered more than rank. She was not trying to become an anti-royal. That would have been another performance, and Sarah was not interested in spending her life reacting for effect. She remained affectionate toward her family, close to the Queen, connected to David, and dutiful when required. But her center moved elsewhere. This is the essential point. Sarah did not flee privilege. She fled chaos. She did not turn her back on the monarchy in some grand rebellious gesture. She did not sell stories, cultivate outrage, or present herself as the wounded child of a famous woman. She simply chose, again and again, the quieter path. It was so quiet that some people mistook it for absence. But absence can be a form of mastery. In a family where visibility had harmed her mother, Sarah made invisibility useful. Margaret may not have understood this fully, at least not at first. To Margaret, withdrawal could feel like rejection. She had spent her life fighting to be seen as more than the spare sister, more than the girl denied her romance, more than a beautiful side figure in Elizabeth's reign. Attention had become tangled with love. If Sarah stepped back, Margaret could feel abandoned, even if Sarah was only protecting herself. That was the tragedy between them. Neither was simply wrong. Margaret wanted devotion from her daughter, not in a crude or calculating way, but in the hungry way of a woman who had been adored publicly and disappointed privately. She wanted family to gather around her, to understand her, to accommodate the pain beneath the glamour. Sarah wanted peace, not in a cold or selfish way, but in the steady way of someone who had grown up near emotional excess and knew its price. One woman's need for closeness became another woman's reason for distance. Everyone around them could see it because the pattern was not subtle. Margaret filled space. Sarah preserved space. Margaret turned injury outward. Sarah turned attention inward. Margaret lived as if life should answer to her feeling. Sarah lived as if feeling should not be allowed to ruin life. The Queen, watching from the center of the family, would have understood more than she said. She had seen Margaret from the beginning, seen the child performer, the thwarted lover, the glittering bride, the humiliated wife, the demanding sister, the adored aunt, the woman who could be impossible and still loved. Elizabeth had a talent for continuing. She continued through war, death, scandal, government crises, family embarrassments, and the ordinary human fatigue that no crown can abolish. Sarah, in her own smaller world, learned a version of that endurance. Not the sovereign's endurance, carried before cameras and parliaments, but the private endurance of a daughter who refuses to let another person's storm become her climate. By the end of the 1970s, the outlines of Sarah's adult self were beginning to appear. She was artistic, reserved, observant, and drawn to people and places that did not demand constant performance. She had been shaped by royal life, but not consumed by it. She knew the codes and could obey them when needed. She knew the family wounds and could avoid pressing them in public. She knew glamour from the inside and therefore did not confuse it with happiness. This knowledge made her unusual. Many people outside palace walls imagined royal life as a ladder. More attention, more rank, more jewels, more invitations, more importance. Sarah had seen the opposite. She had seen attention behave like a creditor. It gives at first, then collects with interest. She had seen jewels shine under unhappy faces. She had seen invitations become obligations, and obligations become traps. She had seen a princess, born to every visible advantage, unable to command the one thing she most needed, a peaceful heart. So Sarah chose the unshowy work of becoming herself. She would continue her studies. She would keep painting. She would remain close to the family without allowing the family to swallow her. She would become one of the Queen's quiet comforts, a niece who did not bring crisis folded inside charm. She would love her mother, but not imitate her. And that difference, gentle as it seemed, was a kind of verdict, not a public verdict. Sarah was too decent for that and perhaps too wise, but families often understand verdicts that are never spoken. A daughter does not need to denounce a mother to reveal what she has survived. She only has to live differently. Princess Margaret had once tried to build a life out of romance, rank, pleasure, and defiance, only to find herself surrounded by consequences. Sarah, watching from the nursery, the schoolroom, and the palace corridor and the edge of scandal, quietly reached for another set of tools: discipline, privacy, art, steadiness, and a talent for leaving before the room caught fire. That was why, even then, the people closest to the family could guess the shape of the future. Sarah would not become a second Margaret. She would not make unhappiness theatrical. She would not let glamour write her character for her. She would not spend her life explaining the wounds of apartment 10. She would walk away slowly, politely, and completely enough that nobody could call it rude. By the time Sarah reached the early 1980s, the royal family was changing its public face again, and she was old enough to understand that change in a way she could not as a child. The monarchy had always presented itself as permanent, but permanence is often a costume stitched very tightly around people who are aging, marrying, failing, and beginning again. The Queen was still steady at the centre. Prince Charles, now a grown man, was being watched with the impatience reserved for heirs who have taken too long to choose a wife. Princess Anne had already married. Divorced rumours had not yet gathered their full strength around younger royals, and the old world of deference was giving way to a more hungry kind of attention. The public no longer wanted to bow and move on. It wanted to look in the windows. Sarah had been raised beside those windows. She knew what looking could do. For her, the safest future was not rebellion. Rebellion is noisy, and noise had never brought much peace to her mother's house. The safer future was self-possession. She would carry her name lightly. She would accept the family obligations that came her way. She would not pretend to be ordinary, because pretending is still a performance. But she would build a life where the most important things happened away from photographers, away from drawing room commentary, and away from her mother's weather. At Bedales, that private self had room to grow. The school suited her because it valued the kind of attention the palace rarely rewarded. It allowed a child to look at a landscape, a pot, a face, a line of shadow, and take time. Royal life did not usually reward time. It rewarded punctuality, presentation, and the ability to smile when a stranger said something foolish about your aunt. Art asked a different question. What do you see when nobody is telling you what you are supposed to see? Sarah seemed to answer that question with relief. She was not seeking a public role as an artistic royal, not in the loud modern sense, where every private interest must be turned into a brand, then a speech, then a scented candle. She was becoming an artist in the old, patient way. Study, draw, look again. Fail quietly. Begin again. There was discipline in it, and discipline suited her. She had seen passion without discipline. It had not impressed her as much as it impressed newspaper columnists. Her mother, meanwhile, remained unmistakably herself. Princess Margaret, after the divorce, had the freedom she had once lacked. But freedom did not make her uncomplicated. She kept her homes, her friends, her rituals, her love of music, her exacting standards, and her capacity to make one late arrival feel like an act of state. She could still be magnificent company. She could still sit in a room and make everyone else a little more alert, as if a match had been struck. But she also carried the bitterness of a woman who had paid heavily for choices that never gave her what they promised. Roddy Llewellyn remained part of her life for years, drifting in and out of the public story with the awkward label of young lover attached to him like luggage nobody wished to claim. To Margaret he had offered affection at a time when she felt unwanted. To the outside world he became a punchline, which was unfair and also inevitable. Royal scandals rarely allow people to remain fully human. They reduce them to roles: the princess, the younger man, the wronged husband, the children in the background expected to stand still while adults are turned into characters. Sarah knew better than most how cruel that reduction could be. Her mother's affair had not been a careless little ornament hung on the family tree. It had altered how people spoke about Margaret. It had made the sorrow in the household visible. It had drawn David and Sarah into a public mood they had not chosen. And yet Sarah did not respond by making her own sorrow public. She seemed to understand something that takes many people longer to learn. When a family has already given the world too much, silence can be an inheritance worth keeping. In 1981, that silence was tested by a very different royal spectacle. Prince Charles married Lady Diana Spencer at St. Paul's Cathedral, and Britain behaved as if a fairy tale had been issued by official notice. Sarah, still a teenager, was one of the bridesmaids. It was a role full of lace, flowers, ceremony, and national attention. The wedding was watched by hundreds of millions around the world, a display so grand that even the most hardened royal servant must have wondered briefly whether the candles had been given their own staff. For the public, it was romance. For the family, it was dynastic relief. For Sarah, it was another lesson in the dangerous gap between what a ceremony says and what a marriage may become. She stood close enough to the myth to smell the flowers. Diana was young, beautiful, aristocratic, and seemingly perfect for the role that had been waiting with its mouth open. She brought freshness into a family that often seemed preserved rather than alive. The public loved her instantly, with the speed and hunger that should have alarmed everyone. Sarah had seen glamour attach itself to her mother like a promise and then a trap. Now she watched it attach itself to Diana with even greater force. The dress, the carriage, the balcony, the shy expression, the whole country sighing into its teacups. It was lovely. It was also a warning written in silk. Sarah did not yet know what would happen to that marriage. Nobody did, not fully. But she knew enough to distrust the first chapter of a royal love story. Her own parents had begun before a television audience, too. There had been jewels, cheers, formal blessings, and the illusion that visibility could protect happiness. It had protected nothing. After the wedding, Sarah returned to the quieter business of becoming an adult. She studied art with seriousness. At Camberwell School of Art, she entered a world where her title might open curiosity, but it could not complete a painting for her. This was one of the great blessings of her chosen path. Art is immune to flattery in the final test. A canvas succeeds or it does not. A tutor may be polite, a friend may be kind, a name may make people lean in, but paint has a rude little democracy of its own. It does not become better because a princess once stood nearby. For Sarah, that must have been liberating. The royal world was full of inherited value. Art demanded earned value, quiet and personal. It did not ask her to compete with her mother. It did not ask her to sparkle. It did not ask whether she was sufficiently amusing at dinner. It asked her to work. She worked. There is a kind of young adulthood that looks dull to outsiders because its drama is internal. No public rebellion, no scandalous lover in a sports car, no feud launched through a friend of a friend. Sarah's drama was steadier and perhaps more difficult. She was trying to separate herself from a powerful mother without turning that separation into cruelty. She had to become different without humiliating Margaret. She had to love her without becoming available to every demand. In ordinary families, this is hard. In royal families, it happens under portraits of people who once solved family tension with exile, war, or a suspiciously convenient annulment. Margaret had always made love feel like a summons. Sarah was learning to make it feel like a boundary. That did not mean she withdrew from her mother entirely. The truth was more tender and more complicated. Sarah could be affectionate, she could be attentive, she could be there when needed. But she did not organize her identity around Margaret. She did not become the daughter who lived to soothe the princess. She did not become the bright companion required to fill the room when other companions failed. This may have hurt Margaret, because Margaret had been hurt before and heard echoes everywhere. But Sarah's distance was not punishment. It was a way of remaining kind, the royal family noticed. They noticed many things, of course. A family that large, old and ceremonial develops a second language made of seating plans, invitations accepted, invitations declined, who arrives at what time, who leaves first, who stands beside whom, who spends Christmas where, and whether anyone says they are perfectly well in a tone that means war. Sarah's quietness was not invisible. It was simply hard to criticize. She did what was required. She behaved with grace. She did not embarrass the institution. She did not trade on grievance. In palace terms, this made her nearly miraculous, like a corgi that balanced the accounts. The Queen grew especially fond of her. Part of that affection came from family intimacy. Sarah was her sister's daughter, and the Queen had known her from infancy. But it also came from temperament. Sarah did not demand. She did not arrive with a crisis hidden behind charm. She had inherited enough royal understanding to know how the machinery worked, but not enough appetite for attention to misuse it. Around her, the Queen could perhaps relax in a way she could not with more volatile relations. Sarah was dutiful without being stiff, affectionate without being theatrical, private without being cold. To the Queen, who spent her life surrounded by people wanting something, that must have been restful. Their bond would become one of the quiet constants of Sarah's life. It did not need grand public declarations. In that family, the strongest attachments often appeared in small gestures, invitations, shared holidays, seating, private conversations, the familiar ease of people who know one another beyond titles. Sarah understood the Queen not as an icon, but as a working woman inside an impossible job. The Queen understood Sarah not as a minor royal accessory, but as someone who had learned young the cost of emotional noise. It was the kind of relationship both women could trust, because neither tried to turn it into a spectacle. Margaret, by contrast, had always suffered when love did not display itself strongly enough. Her daughter and her sister shared a steadiness that Margaret admired in theory and sometimes resented in practice. Sarah did not erupt. Elizabeth did not erupt. Margaret erupted beautifully, which is still an eruption. It could leave those around her brushing ash from the silver. As the 1980s moved forward, Margaret's public image became fixed in a way that was not entirely fair, but not entirely invented. She was the difficult princess, the glamorous divorcee, the smoker with the cutting tongue, the woman on Mystique, the royal who arrived late and expected forgiveness, the sister who had never been quite reconciled to a life of being second. These labels were too small for her, but labels often are. They stuck because they contained enough truth to make denial difficult. Sarah grew up in the shadow of those labels and refused to make herself another one. Her own friendships were quieter. Her romantic life, when it began to matter, was not offered up for general inspection. She had seen what happened when adult desire became a national pastime. She knew that privacy was not merely pleasant, it was protective. It allowed feeling to develop before strangers named it. It allowed mistakes to remain instructive rather than historic. It allowed a young woman to decide who she was before the public decided for her. In art school and beyond, she moved among people who were serious about images, design, and craft. The social tone was different from palace life. There were fewer inherited rules, though plenty of human vanity, because no institution has yet found a reliable cure for that. Sarah could observe artists, teachers, students, and working people whose status did not arrive at birth. She could see ambition outside court circles. She could see failure without scandal. She could see ordinary uncertainty, which is one of the great privileges denied to the overexposed. She also found that a quieter life still required courage. It is easy to imagine withdrawal as passivity. For Sarah, it was active choice. Every family event offered the possibility of being drawn back into Margaret's orbit. Every royal occasion reminded her that she could have taken a more visible path if she wished. She had the birth, the connections, the face, the story, and the public curiosity. A more restless person might have used all of it. A more wounded person might have used it against her mother. Sarah did neither. She chose the harder dignity of not turning family damage into currency. That choice had consequences. It meant fewer headlines, fewer opportunities, and fewer public declarations of importance. It meant being underestimated by people who confuse quiet with lack of substance. It meant letting others occupy the dramatic center, while she built a life almost in the margins. But margins can be generous places. They allow room for work, marriage, children, friendship, and the small loyalties that do not need applause. Sarah seemed to understand that a life can be rich without being loud. David, her brother, was making his own path too. As Viscount Linley, he carried the future Snowdon title and a more visible place in the social story. Like Sarah, he had inherited their father's respect for design and making. Furniture became his field, and it suited the family irony rather well. The children of one of the most theatrical marriages in royal memory both turned toward crafts that require patience, structure, and attention to proportion. A chair cannot be bullied into balance. A painting cannot be charmed into depth. Their parents had lived amid excess emotion. The children chose disciplines where excess had to be controlled. David and Sarah were not identical, but they shared an understanding born from the same rooms. They knew the private Margaret and the public one. They knew Tony's brilliance and damage. They knew that being close to royalty could protect and expose in the same breath. Their bond mattered because each could speak, or not speak, from a place of recognition. In complicated families, the person who remembers the same silences may become more important than the person who offers advice. Margaret's relationship with her children was loving, but love had to pass through her temperament. She adored them in her way. She could be proud of them. She could be amused by them. She could also be demanding, especially when loneliness sharpened her expectations. As Sarah grew more independent, Margaret's need for companionship did not vanish. If anything, the old social rhythm became more important. Friends, house parties, moustique, dinners, theatre, ballet, the small court that gathered around her. These were not only pleasures, they were defences against the fear of being left behind. A divorced royal woman in middle age occupied a strange position. Margaret had rank, money, housing, jewels, and a famous sister. She did not have the central purpose the Queen had. She did not have the fresh public adoration Diana was receiving. She did not have a marriage to organize her daily life. She had pleasures, memories, and a calendar. For a woman of her hunger and pride, that could feel like a very gilded waiting room. Sarah saw that and perhaps pitied it. Pity in a daughter is a dangerous feeling. It can soften resentment, but it can also deepen distance. A child who pities a parent has crossed an invisible line. The parent is no longer the whole sky. She is a person, wounded and flawed, sometimes lovable, sometimes impossible. Sarah's maturity lay in accepting that without making a performance of her disappointment. By the mid-1980s, the larger royal family seemed on the surface to be enjoying renewal. Charles and Diana had produced heirs. Prince William was born in 1982, Prince Harry in 1984, and the public appetite for the young princess and her babies was enormous. The monarchy looked newly emotional, newly photogenic, newly modern. But Sarah, raised in the afterglow and wreckage of the Snowdon marriage, would have known that good photographs are not evidence of peace. Her father's entire career had taught her that an image can be true and incomplete at the same time. This was one reason Sarah's own public appearances felt different. When she attended royal events, she did so without seeming to feed on them. She stood where she was placed. She smiled without inviting a saga. She dressed elegantly without appearing to plead for attention. She had the old family training, but not the old family need to dominate the frame. In a royal scene full of rank, rivalry, and public appetite, Sarah often looked like a person who had remembered there was somewhere else to go afterward. There was always art. After Camberwell, her studies continued, and the discipline of painting held. Still life, landscape, the arrangement of objects and colour, the study of quiet forms, these suited her because they offered calm without emptiness. A still life can be dramatic if you know how to look. A glass beside fruit, a shadow across cloth, a flower bending in a vase, all of it can carry tension, mortality, restraint, and beauty without shouting. It is not hard to see why Sarah might have loved such subjects. They allowed her to make feeling visible without naming the family wound. Her mother's world had taught her that beauty could be used as armor. Sarah's art suggested beauty could also be used as attention. The distinction mattered. Margaret used beauty to heighten herself and her surroundings, to insist on standards, to hold off decline. Sarah used beauty to look outward. One gathered the room around the self. The other stepped back and watched the room breathe. This was not a rejection of Margaret's taste. It was a different moral arrangement. Still, the mother and daughter remained tied. No walk away from a mother is ever simple, especially not when love survives. Sarah did not cut Margaret off. She did not disappear. She remained part of the family pattern, present for occasions, loyal in the way that counted, and close enough to help when help became necessary. But emotionally she was building a bridge with a gate in the middle. Margaret could cross sometimes. She could not storm through at will. That gate was Sarah's quiet triumph. It was also the reason people understood why she stepped back. Those who had known Margaret in full force did not need a pamphlet. They knew how much energy she could require. They knew how difficult it was to be loved by her when her own need was raging. They knew that Sarah's gentleness was not weakness, but self-defense refined into manners. In another family she might have had to explain herself. In this one, explanation was unnecessary. Everyone had seen the evidence at dinner. As Sarah moved through her 20s, the outlines of her future came closer. She would not be a professional royal in the public imagination. She would not build her life around royal tours or interviews. She would remain in the royal circle, but she would stand slightly apart, where the air was clearer. The old court would always know who she was. The public would recognize her at major occasions. Yet she would belong most deeply to a private life of work, relationships, and chosen calm. This was not small. It was almost defiant in its modesty. In a culture increasingly obsessed with visibility, Sarah treated visibility as something to be managed carefully, like a candle near paper. She had learned that from Margaret, though perhaps not as Margaret intended. Her mother had shown her what happens when beauty, longing, rank, and publicity become tangled. Her father had shown her how images could seduce and distort. Her aunt had shown her how restraint could become power. Sarah took all those lessons and made from them a life that refused to be consumed. Then, as often happens when a person has stopped chasing drama, love arrived without needing a royal announcement to justify itself. It did not arrive in a ballroom built for dynastic inspection. It did not arrive under pressure from courtiers calculating public approval. It came through work, art, and the kind of life Sarah had deliberately moved toward. Daniel Chatto belonged to a creative world rather than a courtly one. He was an actor for a time, an artist, and the son of theatrical parents, which meant he knew something about performance without mistaking it for the whole of life. He had his own background, his own talents, and crucially, no visible desire to turn Sarah into a stage. That mattered more than any title he did not have. Sarah had seen a marriage between a princess and an artist become a contest of ego, desire, and humiliation. She was not likely to be impressed by charm alone. Charm had been thick in the air of her childhood, and it had not prevented doors from closing too sharply. What she needed was steadiness, respect, and the space to remain herself. Daniel offered the possibility of that. He was connected enough to understand her world, but not swallowed by it. He knew art, but not as a weapon. He understood performance, but did not seem to demand that life become one. For Sarah, this was no small distinction. The beginning of their relationship did not produce the kind of scandal that had once followed Margaret. There was no constitutional crisis, no church problem, no island photograph detonating across breakfast tables. It unfolded with privacy, which in Sarah's life was almost the highest form of romance. To be allowed to know someone before the world named the relationship was a luxury her mother had rarely enjoyed, and one she had sometimes helped destroy by choosing men who came wrapped in complication. Margaret watched her daughter moving toward a different kind of love. What she felt about that is difficult to know fully. Pride, perhaps. Relief, perhaps. A sting, too, because a child's happiness can sometimes illuminate a parent's losses with unkind brightness. Sarah had the chance to choose calmly where Margaret had so often chosen under pressure, rebellion, or hunger. Sarah could build quietly where Margaret had tried to dazzle her way out of pain. A generous mother would want that for her daughter. Margaret could be generous, but she was also human, and humans are not always graceful when confronted with the lives they did not have. By then, Sarah knew how to keep loving her without handing over the steering wheel. That was the real walk away. Not abandonment, not public rejection, not the cruel satisfaction of proving oneself better. It was the steady movement from being Princess Margaret's daughter to being Lady Sarah, artist, sister, niece, friend, and woman in her own right. She would always carry her mother's history. She would not live inside it. And in the royal family, where history often behaves like a relative who refuses to leave after dinner, that was a remarkable escape. The first thing that made Daniel Chatto different was that he did not seem to arrive with an army of consequences behind him. In royal life, a suitor is almost never just a suitor. He is a background check with shoes. He is a family, a religion, a set of old romances, a possible headline, a risk to the seating plan, and in the most serious cases, a problem for the government by breakfast. Princess Margaret had learned that lesson with Peter Townsend, then learned another version with Tony Armstrong-Jones. Love was never allowed to remain only love. It was always inspected, polished, delayed, questioned, or pushed into a corner until it changed shape. Sarah had seen enough of that to distrust theatrical beginnings. Daniel did not look like a man sent by history to cause a constitutional headache. He came from the arts, not from the machinery of court. His father, Tom Chatto, had been an actor and theatrical agent. His mother, Ros Chatto, had also belonged to the creative world. Daniel himself had acted, painted, and moved among people who understood performance without necessarily wanting to live inside one forever. That mattered. He was not dazzled by a room because he knew rooms could be staged. He was not hunting for rank as if a title were a prize pheasant. He had his own life, his own eye, his own quieter center. For Sarah, that was not romantic in the usual public way. It was better. It was useful. She had grown up around dazzling people who were not always safe people. Charm had passed through Kensington Palace in clouds. Talent had been everywhere. Beauty had been arranged, photographed, worn, bought, praised, and occasionally used as a weapon. Sarah knew that glitter could hide a bruise, and that a clever man could make cruelty sound interesting. Daniel brought something less spectacular and more valuable: steadiness that did not need applause. Their relationship unfolded without the fever that had surrounded Margaret. That alone was a sign of how far Sarah had moved from her mother's path. Margaret had been made famous by longing before she was married, then famous by glamour, then famous by unhappiness. Sarah had no wish to become famous by romance. She did not need the public to bless her feelings before she trusted them. She did not seem to measure love by how dramatically it announced itself. There was a kind of royal wisdom in that. In families built on display, the private choice can be the strongest one. Sarah did not need to defy the Queen. She did not need to shock society. She did not need to prove she was modern by humiliating the old order. Her rebellion, if it can be called that, was gentler and harder to criticize. She chose a man who suited her, and she refused to make the choice into theatre. Princess Margaret, watching from the side, must have noticed the contrast. Her own marriage to Tony had begun as a blaze. The first televised royal wedding, Westminster Abbey filled with rank and expectation, a princess in a tiara she had bought herself, a photographer bridegroom raised into the peerage soon afterward, the public convinced that a clever modern match had solved the old sadness of Peter Townsend. It had looked like a door opening. Years later, it looked more like a beautifully painted trap. Sarah's courtship did not have that flavour. No nation waited anxiously. No cabinet minister leaned toward the matter as if a daughter's heart were a public file. No archbishop hovered in the background like a moral weather report. This was almost shocking in its peace. The daughter of Princess Margaret, the child of one of the most public royal divorces of the century, had found a way to love without feeding the machine. That did not mean there were no family feelings. There are always family feelings. They gather around weddings like guests who were not invited, but know the house well. For Margaret, Sarah's happiness was tender ground. She loved her daughter. She admired beauty, talent, and the making of a proper life. But she was also a woman whose own romantic history had left deep marks. A daughter marrying calmly can make a mother feel both grateful and pierced. The mother sees joy, and behind it, without wishing to, sees the road she never took. Margaret had once wanted permission to marry a man she loved and had been denied. She had later married a man who seemed to offer freedom and found herself battling him in public ruins. Sarah was stepping into marriage without that vast machinery of denial and spectacle. It was what any mother should want. It was also, for Margaret, a mirror held at a difficult angle. Sarah by then had learned not to let her mother's feelings become the whole weather. She did not exclude Margaret. She did not punish her. She did not offer the public any grand story of distance or hurt. But she moved with a steadiness that made clear she was not asking her mother to define the marriage. That was important. In Princess Margaret's world, love often came with hierarchy. Who was central? Who was waiting? Who had disappointed whom? Sarah's love for Daniel belonged first to Sarah and Daniel. For a royal daughter, that was a quiet form of liberation. The wedding came on July 14th, 1994, at St. Stephen Walbrook in the City of London. It was not Westminster Abbey. It was not St. Paul's Cathedral under a mountain of national expectation. It was a beautiful London church designed by Christopher Wren, with a round interior that seemed to gather people inward rather than stretch them into state ceremony. Sarah wore a simple dress by Jasper Conran, elegant and restrained, with flowers in her hair. The whole event carried the message she had been sending for years without saying it aloud. This is family, not national drama. This is marriage, not spectacle. This is joy, and it does not require a parade to prove itself. The guest list still glittered, because Sarah could not marry as if she had been raised above a greengrocer in Sussex. The Queen was there. The Queen Mother was there. Prince Charles was there. Diana, Princess of Wales, attended at a time when her own marriage had already become a national wound no one could stop touching. Princess Margaret was there, mother of the bride, carrying inside her everything that day must have stirred. Pride, memory, regret, affection, and perhaps the faint irritation that the world seemed to find Sarah's restraint so admirable when Margaret had never been built for restraint at all. Daniel waited as a man marrying a woman, not as a social climber receiving a royal upgrade. That distinction mattered. He did not become a prince or an earl or a new ornament in the royal cabinet. Sarah became Lady Sarah Chatto, not because the marriage raised her, but because it allowed her to settle more fully into herself. The name itself seemed to soften the old story. Armstrong Jones had carried the echo of Snowdon glamour and parental fracture. Chatto sounded quieter, more domestic, more chosen. For Sarah, that was no small thing. She had walked down the aisle carrying not only flowers but family history. Behind her stood the teenage bridesmaid at Charles and Diana's wedding, the child of Kensington Palace, the daughter who had watched photographers turn her mother's desire into scandal, the young artist who had chosen work over display. Ahead of her stood a marriage that would not cure the past, because marriages are poor doctors, but might give her something the past had withheld, a home whose peace did not depend on one person's mood. That same decade had been brutal for the royal family. In 1992, the Queen had given a speech marking 40 years on the throne and called the year an annus horribilis, a horrible year, which was a very royal way of saying the roof had leaked, the children had misbehaved, and the newspapers had brought binoculars. 3 of her children's marriages were in distress or collapse. Prince Andrew and Sarah, Duchess of York, separated. Princess Anne divorced Mark Phillips. Prince Charles and Diana formally separated after years of private misery had become public combat. Then Windsor Castle caught fire in November, as if even the building had decided to join the family mood. Sarah lived through that period from a revealing position. She was close enough to the family to understand the pain, but far enough from the centre to avoid being swallowed by the worst of it. She could see the pattern repeating in a new generation. Royal weddings had been treated as national reassurance. Then the marriages turned human. The public, which had been invited to adore the fairy tale, now demanded access to the wreckage. It was the Snowdon story again, enlarged and sharpened for a hungrier media age. Diana became the figure around whom that hunger gathered most fiercely. Sarah had once stood beside Diana as a bridesmaid, part of the soft machinery of a wedding the world wanted to believe in. By the mid-1990s, that image belonged to another country. Diana was separated from Charles, speaking through friends, photographers, interviews, gestures, clothes, and silences that were not really silent at all. She was wounded, charismatic, strategic, vulnerable, and loved by the public with a force that made the palace uneasy. Margaret, who had known what it was to be the glamorous, suffering royal woman, did not occupy the same position. Diana was younger, more publicly adored, and far more dangerous to the old emotional rules. Sarah watched without turning herself into commentary. That was one of her great skills. She did not need to add a voice to every family crisis. She did not stand on the edge of disaster waving for attention. In those years, the royal family had enough people accidentally setting fire to curtains. Sarah did not need to bring matches. Her marriage to Daniel became, by contrast, a small island of normality. Not ordinary normality, royal-adjacent normality, which still comes with better hats and more police awareness than most people experience. But emotionally, it was calmer. The Queen valued that. By the 1990s, Elizabeth had endured enough family turmoil to know the difference between a relative who drained the room and one who restored it. Sarah belonged to the second category. The Queen's affection for her niece seemed to deepen not because Sarah performed devotion, but because she did not perform anything. She was present, she was discreet. She understood duty without confusing it with self-importance. In a family increasingly battered by interviews, separations, biographies and leaks, discretion became almost heroic. Anyone could keep a secret when nothing was happening. Sarah kept her dignity when everything was happening. Margaret had her own view of discretion, and it was complicated. She came from an older royal culture where one did not complain in public, but she also came from a temperament that could not keep feeling politely tucked forever. She had spent years both hiding and revealing herself. She could insist on protocol while living in ways that made protocol sweat through its shirt. She had suffered from public judgment, but she had also courted the kind of company and settings that made judgment likely. She was, in many ways, a woman caught between the sealed world of her parents and the exposed world of her children's generation. Sarah belonged to neither entirely. She made her own smaller country. After the wedding, she and Daniel built their life in London, close enough to the royal orbit but not trapped at its centre. They were artists, parents in waiting, and private people by choice rather than accident. There were royal events, of course, trooping the colour, family services, weddings, funerals, balcony moments, the seasonal gatherings that make the monarchy look like one long appointment with tradition. Sarah attended when appropriate, serene and carefully dressed, often near the Queen, often noticed by those who knew to look. But she never gave the impression that public notice was feeding her. This alone separated her sharply from Margaret. Margaret had been raised in a time when to be noticed was part of the royal bargain. She knew how to be admired and expected admiration to behave properly. Sarah had seen the invoice. She knew attention arrives smiling, then stays too long, then rearranges your furniture. So she kept her public presence limited, precise, and calm. She did not vanish from the family. She simply refused to become public property. In July 1996, Sarah gave birth to her first son, Samuel David Benedict Chatto. The names carried family weight without shouting. Samuel was not born to a title that would define his every step. He was in the line of succession because royal blood does not stop being royal because a mother likes privacy. But he entered a very different kind of life from the one Sarah had known as a child. His grandmother was Princess Margaret. His great-aunt was the Queen. His family tree was ridiculous in the formal sense. Yet his parents gave him something rarer than rank, a home not organized around scandal. That was Sarah's most direct answer to her childhood. She did not issue statements about generational healing. She did not write a book. She did not sit beneath soft lighting and explain that she had broken the cycle. She simply lived differently. Her children would know the royal family, but they would not be raised as ornaments of their grandmother's drama. They would attend occasions, understand the connections, and grow up with privilege, certainly. But their emotional center would be their parents, not the moods of Kensington Palace. For Margaret, becoming a grandmother offered another chance at tenderness. She was capable of deep affection, and grandchildren can sometimes receive the softness that children met only in flashes. A grandchild does not challenge a woman's identity in quite the same way a daughter does. A grandchild can be adored, indulged, admired, and returned before the difficult work begins. Margaret loved family, even when family life exposed her weaknesses. Samuel represented continuity without the old domestic battleground. He was Sarah's child, yes, but also part of Margaret's line, proof that the story moved forward without asking permission from past grief. Sarah, however, remained careful. She could love her mother and still protect her children from being absorbed into Margaret's emotional court. That required judgment. Too much distance would look cruel. Too much closeness could reopen old patterns. Sarah chose the middle path, respectful, affectionate, available when it mattered, but never surrendered. This was not the cold withdrawal of a resentful daughter. It was the disciplined boundary of a woman who knew exactly what unfiltered closeness could cost. In 1997, the royal family was shaken again, more violently than anyone could have imagined only a few years earlier. Diana died in Paris on August 31st, after a car crash in the Pont de l'Alma tunnel while being pursued by photographers. The news struck Britain like a physical blow. She was 36. Her sons were children. The public grief was enormous, uncontrolled, and accusatory. Flowers filled the spaces outside palaces. Crowds wept in the streets. The monarchy, so trained in private mourning and public restraint, suddenly found that restraint looked to many people like indifference. Sarah was not at the center of that storm, but she understood its language. She had watched Diana enter the family as a young bride under the world's gaze. She had watched the marriage collapse in public. She had seen what happens when a woman of beauty, rank, unhappiness, and media power becomes larger than the institution that tried to contain her. Diana had turned royal suffering into a public relationship. Margaret had suffered under public fascination, but Diana had become a kind of emotional mirror for millions. Her death made the mirror shatter. For the Queen, it was one of the hardest weeks of her reign. For the family, it was grief under accusation. For William and Harry, it was personal devastation displayed before the entire world. For Sarah, it must have confirmed every private lesson of her life. Fame could be lethal, attention could become pursuit, and a royal story once handed to the public could never be fully taken back. Margaret, too, would have felt the shock, though she and Diana were not simple allies. Margaret could be unsympathetic to emotional display when it threatened the family order, even though she had hardly lived like a carved monument herself. She belonged to the old rule. Suffer privately, misbehave discreetly if you must, but do not break the frame. Diana had broken the frame, partly because the frame had broken her. Sarah, who loved the old family but understood damage, likely saw the tragedy with fewer slogans than the public did. Once again, she said little. That silence was not emptiness. It was respect. Some griefs become smaller when people rush to decorate them with opinion. Sarah had learned that from childhood too. The most important things in her life were rarely the things most loudly discussed. In 1999, Sarah and Daniel had their second son, Arthur Robert Nathaniel Chatto. With Arthur's birth, the family Sarah had built took fuller shape. 2 sons, an artist husband, a private household, royal connections kept in proportion. Her life did not lack distinction. It simply placed distinction in the background. This, more than anything, showed how far she had come from Princess Margaret's world. Margaret had often needed the room to recognize her before she could relax inside it. Sarah seemed to relax only when the room forgot to stare. By then, Margaret herself was aging into a more fragile version of the woman the world thought it knew. Years of smoking and drinking had not been kind to her health. That is not moral judgment. Bodies are poor courtiers and eventually stop pretending not to notice. In 1998, Margaret suffered a mild stroke while at Mystique. The island that had once represented escape now became the setting for vulnerability. The princess, who had ruled over lunches, swims, and evening drinks with precise authority, was suddenly reminded that flesh does not respect rank. The sea was still blue. The servants still knew what to do. The body had other plans. The stroke marked a change in the family story. Until then, Margaret's difficulties had been emotional, social, romantic, reputational. Now they were physical. Physical decline has a way of stripping glamour down to the frame. A woman may still have jewels, titles, memories, and a voice trained to command, but illness asks its questions without bowing. Can you walk? Can you see? Can you manage the stairs? Can you hold the cigarette? Can you bear the pity in other people's faces? Margaret did not bear pity easily. She had always wanted to be admired, never handled. Illness threatened the careful construction of self that had carried her through disappointment. If she could no longer be the dazzling princess, the demanding hostess, the woman of appetite and style, then who was she? Sister of the Queen, yes. Mother of David and Sarah, yes. Grandmother now. But identity built on presence suffers when the body begins to withdraw from the room before the mind is ready. Sarah's distance changed in this period. It did not disappear, but it became more compassionate. A daughter who has protected herself from a mother's storms may find, as the mother weakens, that the old storm has become weathered and human. Boundaries remain necessary, but anger loses some of its heat. Sarah had never made a public display of grievance. Now that restraint allowed her to be present without contradiction. She did not have to reverse a public feud, because she had never created one. She did not have to explain forgiveness, because she had never advertised resentment. She could simply help. That is one of the rewards of quiet dignity. It leaves room for mercy. Margaret's health troubles continued to expose the difference between image and life. In 1999, while on Mystique, she badly scalded her feet in a bath, an accident that affected her mobility and made walking more difficult. The details were almost painfully ordinary, not a scandal, not a lover, not a constitutional drama. Hot water, injured feet, a proud woman suddenly less able to move as she pleased. For someone who had lived so much of life in entrances and exits, difficulty walking carried its own humiliation. Sarah understood humiliation, though she rarely spoke of it. She had known the humiliation of being a child inside public scandal, the quiet embarrassment of headlines, the helplessness of seeing adults make choices children must carry. Now the humiliation belonged to her mother in another form. Margaret, who had once made rooms wait, had to wait for her own body. The daughter who had once stepped back from Margaret's force now saw the force reduced by pain. The family adjusted. David had his responsibilities, his own family, his work, and his position as Margaret's son and heir to the Snowdon title. Sarah had Daniel, Samuel, Arthur, her art, and the quiet life she had built with care. Yet Margaret's decline tugged them both closer. Illness is a summons no decent child can entirely refuse, even when the past is complicated. The old grievances do not vanish, but they must share the room with medicine, appointments, chairs, walking sticks, and the practical work of care. Princess Margaret had always been difficult to manage. Now she was difficult to lose by degrees. That is a different sorrow. The person remains but altered. The old sharpness may still flash. The old standards may remain. The old capacity to wound may not disappear. But beneath it, everyone can see the body failing. For Sarah, this must have brought a confusing tenderness. Her mother was still her mother, still capable of the old demands, still Princess Margaret in every meaningful and inconvenient sense. But she was also a vulnerable woman moving toward the end of her strength. Sarah's gift was that she could come near without being swallowed. She had spent decades learning that skill. As a child, she had retreated inward. As a student, she had chosen art. As a wife, she had chosen steadiness. As a mother, she had built a calmer home. Now, as Margaret's health declined, those choices gave her the strength to return on her own terms. She could sit beside her mother without becoming the frightened girl in apartment 10. She could serve without surrendering. She could love without being ruled. And Margaret, proud as she was, may have understood more than she ever admitted. By the end of the 1990s, the great social world that had carried her was thinning. Friends aged, lovers receded into memory, parties changed. The public had moved on to newer dramas, as the public always does after helping itself generously to the old ones. Diana was gone. Charles was slowly rebuilding a future with Camilla in the open shadows. The Queen was older, still steady, but no longer untouched by public criticism. The monarchy had survived, but survival had become visibly costly. Margaret remained at the edge of the royal stage, no longer the young beauty, no longer the scandalous sister in full blaze, not yet absent, but fading. Sarah did not gloat over that fading. She did not need to. Her life had already answered the question. She had walked away not to win against her mother, but to avoid becoming her mother's echo. She had built a marriage without spectacle, raised children without turning them into props, and kept a bond with the Queen that rested on trust rather than drama. The daughter once formed in the shadow of Margaret now stood in a light of her own, soft but unmistakable. The saddest part was that Margaret could see it too. Not because Sarah announced it, not because anyone said the words at lunch, but because the evidence was there in the calm house, the loyal husband, the small boys, the work, the absence of scandal, the family affection that did not require conquest. Sarah had not rejected everything Margaret loved. She loved beauty. She loved art. She loved family. She understood rank and ceremony. She simply refused the bargain that had consumed her mother, the belief that being seen could make one safe. Now, as Margaret's body began to fail, that belief looked more fragile than ever. The old glamour could not steady a hand. The old title could not undo a stroke. The old deference could not make stares easier. What remained were the people who came quietly, not for the performance, but for the person beneath it. Sarah came quietly. That had always been her way. By the turn of the new century, Princess Margaret had entered the part of life she was least suited to endure, the part where other people began to decide what she could manage. For a woman who had spent decades arranging rooms around her preferences, this was a harsh little joke from nature, and nature has never been known for good manners. Margaret had been used to commands, invitations, refusals, delays, and late arrivals. She had not been used to asking whether a staircase was possible. She had not been used to calculating pain. She had not been used to being watched, not because she was glamorous, but because someone feared she might fall. Illness changed the air around her. It did not make her simple. It did not turn her suddenly into a soft old lady in a cardigan, smiling at everyone and regretting nothing before tea. That was not Margaret, and it would be dishonest to pretend otherwise. She remained proud. She remained exacting. She could still summon the old royal edge when she disliked what was happening around her, which was often because weakness offers a proud person so many opportunities for dislike. But her power had altered. The people around her were no longer merely managing a difficult princess. They were caring for a fading woman who still remembered, with painful clarity, what it meant to be dazzling. Sarah, by then, was no longer the watchful child in the palace corridor. She was a wife, a mother, an artist, and one of the quieter, trusted figures in the royal family. Her sons, Samuel and Arthur, were small, full of the ordinary needs that protect a household from becoming too grand. Children want meals, stories, socks, sleep, comfort, and answers to questions that can defeat a philosopher in 3 seconds. Their presence grounded Sarah. Whatever storms lingered around Kensington Palace, she had her own home now, and her own daily order. She had built the very thing her childhood had lacked, peace that did not require permission from a dramatic adult. This made her return to Margaret more powerful, not less. Sarah did not come as a trapped daughter. She came as a grown woman. That distinction mattered. She could visit, help, endure, and love without being swallowed back into the old emotional arrangement. She could see her mother clearly, which is sometimes the final mercy adult children can offer. Not the fantasy mother, not the monster mother, the real one. Brilliant, wounded, proud, funny, difficult, frightened, and declining. Margaret needed that clarity, even if she did not always welcome it. The royal family had long experience with illness behind closed doors. Kings and queens may live in palaces, but bodies remain stubbornly democratic. They fail in private, and then the private failure must be translated into public dignity. A statement is issued. A carriage is adjusted. A photograph is released or not released. The public is told enough to understand, but not enough to feel it has been invited into the sick room. This was the old method, and Margaret belonged to it. She did not want public sympathy as if it were a basket of fruit. Yet decline has a way of leaking out. Her appearances became more limited. Her mobility suffered. The woman who had once seemed born for entrances now had to choose them carefully. Every public sighting carried the silent commentary people attach to famous bodies. She looks frail, she looks thinner, she looks tired, she looks older. These are observations made by strangers who mean no harm, yet they are still a kind of theft. Margaret, who had once been observed for beauty, now found herself observed for damage. Sarah understood the cruelty in that. Her whole life had taught her that being seen is not the same as being known. At Kensington Palace, the rooms held decades of memory. There were pictures, furniture, letters, clothes, objects, and the invisible sediment of arguments no housekeeper can dust away. Margaret had lived among beautiful things because beauty reassured her. It told her that order was possible. It allowed her to command at least the surface of life. But in illness, even the most exquisite room can feel like a stage after the audience has gone home. Sarah's art had trained her to look at objects differently. A chair was not only a chair. A vase was not only a vase. Light on a table could reveal time passing more brutally than any newspaper headline. To sit near Margaret in those years must have been to see a still life of royal decline. The cigarette habit finally taking its revenge, the glass placed within reach, the flowers properly arranged, the walking aids, the careful clothes, the eyes still sharp enough to know what had been lost. Margaret had not lived like a financial lesson, but money threaded through the final years in quiet, practical ways. She had a royal allowance, homes connected to her status, jewels, art, furniture, and possessions gathered over a lifetime of rank and taste. But wealth in royal circles can be strangely complicated. Some things are owned personally. Some are connected to a role. Some come from family. Some have emotional value far beyond their market price. Some become a problem the moment the owner dies, because grief has barely entered the room before valuation does. Death in a grand family brings not only mourning, but paperwork with excellent posture. Sarah and David would eventually face that reality. For now, they faced the slower reality. Their mother was nearing the end. In early 2001, Margaret suffered another stroke. The news was serious, and those who knew her understood that the old resilience was narrowing. She had survived scandal, heartbreak, divorce, ridicule, loneliness, and many lunches that began late enough to qualify as policy. But strokes are not social opponents. They do not respond to rank. They are not charmed by a tiara or discouraged by a sharp remark. They take what they take. Sarah was there through this final narrowing, and her presence had the quiet force of a long story coming full circle. The daughter who had once stepped away from Margaret's emotional intensity now came close because the intensity had been overtaken by need. This is one of the hardest movements in family life. Distance protects you when a parent is powerful. Closeness becomes necessary when that power collapses. The old injuries remain, but they no longer occupy the whole room. Beside a hospital bed, or a chair by the window, or a mother struggling to speak and move as she once did, childhood anger can begin to look both justified and exhausted. Sarah did not need to announce forgiveness. Her behavior was enough. She had always been discreet, and discretion in this case was not the cold habit of the upper class. It was kindness. She did not make Margaret's decline into a public reconciliation story. She did not use her mother's weakness to settle old accounts. She did not present herself as the dutiful daughter at last, as if life were a courtroom and the jury had been waiting. She simply did what love required, within the boundaries she had spent years earning. That was the mature form of the walk-away, the ability to return without losing herself. Margaret died on February 9, 2002, at King Edward VII Hospital in London. She was 71. The cause was connected to another stroke and heart complications. The news came on a winter morning, and for the royal family it was both a public event and a private blow. The Queen's younger sister was gone. The sparkling, troublesome, adored, exasperating child of King George VI and Queen Elizabeth had reached the end of a life that had seemed, at every stage, too restless for its own container. The public remembered many Margarets. There was the pretty princess of the post-war years, the one who made Britain feel young again after rationing and grief. There was the woman who loved Peter Townsend and gave him up, whether from duty, pressure, or some mixture too painful to untangle. There was the bride in the Baltimore tiara, marrying Tony Armstrong-Jones while millions watched and believed that glamour could heal a wound. There was the sharp hostess, the smoker, the island figure, the divorced royal, the woman with Roddy Llewellyn in The Sun. There was the difficult sister, the wounded spare, the cautionary tale in Saturn. Sarah remembered someone more complicated. She remembered the mother, not the headline. A mother who could hurt, a mother who could charm, a mother whose need filled space before anyone else had set down a handbag, a mother who loved beauty and demanded standards because standards were one way to keep despair properly dressed. A mother who had not always protected her children from adult chaos, but who had also given them art, taste, intelligence, and a direct connection to a vanished royal world. Grief does not require a person to edit the dead into saints. In fact, honest grief often refuses. Sarah's grief would have contained tenderness, relief, sorrow, memory, and perhaps the strange calm that comes when a long illness ends. When a difficult parent dies, the child loses not only the parent, but also the hope that the relationship might still become easy. That hope may have been small, perhaps only a candle stub, but its extinguishing changes the room. Sarah had walked away from Margaret in life, gently and steadily. In death, there was no further distance to take. The story between them had ended, and the silence that followed was final. The funeral was held at St. George's Chapel, Windsor, the place Margaret had chosen. It was also the 50th anniversary of her father's funeral, a fact so poignant it seemed almost arranged by someone with a merciless sense of symmetry. Margaret had adored King George VI, and his death in 1952 had altered the emotional structure of her life. Her sister became queen. Her mother became a widow. Margaret, still young, became the glittering spare in a family suddenly reorganized around duty and loss. To be mourned on that same date closed a circle. The Queen Mother, then 101, attended in frail health. The Queen attended as both sovereign and sister. David and Sarah attended as children who had known the private cost of the public woman being honored. Daniel was there with Sarah. The family stood inside a chapel built to hold history, but grief is never entirely historical to those carrying it. Stone can make sorrow look grand. It does not make it less personal. Margaret had chosen cremation, which was unusual for a senior royal of her generation. Her ashes were later placed in the royal vault at St. George's Chapel, near her father, and then with her parents in the King George VI Memorial Chapel after the Queen Mother died soon afterward. Even in death, Margaret sought closeness to the father whose loss had haunted her. The girl who had once been his darling returned at last to the family arrangement that had shaped everything. Only weeks later, on March 30th, 2002, the Queen Mother died. For the Queen, the losses came with brutal closeness. Sister in February, mother in March. The public saw ceremonies, black clothes, solemn processions, hymns, guards, flowers, and the careful choreography of national mourning. But inside the family, two central emotional pillars had vanished. The Queen Mother had been a link to the wartime monarchy, to King George VI, to a world of duty with clearer rules and thicker curtains. Margaret had been the Queen's intimate opposite, the younger sister who had irritated, delighted, worried, and accompanied her for more than 70 years. Sarah lost both a mother and a grandmother figure in the family hierarchy, but she also saw her aunt, the Queen, endure a private double bereavement under public expectation. This deepened their bond. Sarah was one of the people who could understand the layers without needing them explained. She knew what Margaret had meant to the Queen, not as a national figure, but as a sister. Sisters can be rivals, burdens, confidants, mirrors, and witnesses to the version of oneself no one else remembers. Elizabeth had lost the one person who knew her before the crown became permanent. Their lives had diverged wildly, one into sovereign duty, the other into beauty, frustration, and scandal. But the childhood thread had never broken. Now it had. Sarah's quiet nature made her valuable in that grief. She did not need to manage the Queen. One does not manage the Queen, unless one is a corgi with unusual confidence. But she could offer the comfort of presence without demand. She could sit, speak, remember, and not require the grief to become more expressive than the grieving woman wished. Elizabeth had spent a lifetime mastering the art of continuing. Sarah understood the cost of that continuation because she had learned her own version, in a smaller, more private key. After the funerals came the objects. This is where family history becomes painfully practical. Princess Margaret left behind possessions that carried beauty, memory, and considerable value. Jewels, furniture, art, silver, porcelain, and personal things gathered across decades had to be sorted. Some items were deeply connected to royal history, others belonged to Margaret as a private woman. All of them, in one way or another, carried the fingerprints of a life spent among luxury and longing. David and Sarah inherited their mother's estate. The estate was valued in the millions, and inheritance tax created a very plain problem. In simple terms, when someone with a valuable estate dies, the government takes a portion before the heirs can settle fully into what remains. In ordinary families, this might mean selling a house. In Princess Margaret's family, it meant selling pieces of a royal life. There is something almost indecent about how quickly the market can follow mourning. A tiara becomes a lot number. A bracelet becomes an estimate. A silver box becomes provenance. A cigarette case becomes a story. The public, which once consumed Margaret's beauty and scandal, now had the chance to consume her belongings. Not all of this was crude. Auctions can preserve history, place objects with collectors, and raise necessary funds. But for a daughter, the process must have been strange. The things that had filled her mother's rooms, things she had seen not as museum pieces but as part of the scenery of childhood, were now being translated into pounds. The most famous of these sales would come in 2006, when many items from Princess Margaret's collection were auctioned at Christie's. The auction drew enormous attention. Of course it did. Margaret had always drawn attention, even in absence. Her jewels and objects seemed to offer one last chance to enter her world without being required to endure her moods. Buyers could acquire glamour without the late lunch. The sale included important jewels, personal items, furniture, and works of art. Among the most watched pieces was the Poltimore tiara, the grand diamond tiara Margaret had worn in portraits and at her wedding, a piece so closely tied to her image that seeing it on an auction block felt almost like seeing a crown divorced from a head. The sale raised far more than initial expectations. People wanted not only diamonds, but contact. They wanted a fragment of the woman, the myth, the tragedy, the style. The public fascination that had surrounded Margaret in life gathered again around her possessions. It was a final, glittering performance, but one she could not control. That may have been the bitterest irony. The woman who had curated herself so fiercely became, after death, a collection to be dispersed. For David and Sarah, the decision was practical, not merely sentimental. There were taxes to pay. There were estates to settle. There was no endless private vault into which every object could disappear untouched. Royal blood does not abolish arithmetic. The sale was criticized by some who disliked seeing royal objects leave family hands, especially items associated with such a recognizable princess. But criticism is easy when one is not holding the bill. The heirs had to balance memory, duty, money, and reality. In aristocratic families, sentiment often survives only after the accountant has finished speaking. Sarah was not known to have enjoyed this process publicly, and it would be hard to imagine she did. She was an artist. Objects mattered to her, not only for value but for presence, line, texture, memory. To part with things from her mother's, life must have carried a private ache, even if some items were too grand, too loaded, or too costly to keep. The Poltimore tiara, in particular, represented not only jewels, but the great turning point of Margaret's life. The wedding that had promised renewal and led by degrees to fracture. Selling it was not simply a financial act. It was the closing of a chapter that had begun before Sarah was born and shaped her childhood before she understood why. Yet Sarah did not turn the sale into a public drama. She did not weep for cameras over diamonds. She did not explain herself in a long interview. She did not invite strangers into the emotional arithmetic of inheritance. That was exactly her style. Do the necessary thing. Keep the feeling private. Let others talk if they must. Others always must. The auction also revealed something deeper about Margaret's legacy. Her life had been made of contradictions. She was royal, but not central. Rich, but dependent on structures larger than herself. Free, but never free enough. Loved, but often lonely. Admired, but frequently judged. Her possessions reflected the same tension. Beautiful things, yes, but beauty acquired in a life that had not delivered peace. The jewels sparkled. The human story behind them remained troubled. Sarah's own inheritance was not mainly the jewels, it was the warning. She had inherited Margaret's eye for beauty, but not her dependence on admiration. She had inherited access to royal ceremony, but not the hunger to dominate it. She had inherited a complicated name, but not the need to make that name louder. She had inherited memories of tension, but turned them into a home where tension was not the organizing principle. If Margaret left behind diamonds, furniture, and headlines, Sarah carried away the more private legacy. Proof that a woman can come from glamour and still choose calm. By the mid-2000s, Sarah had settled into a public identity that seemed almost deliberately unmarketable. She was seen at important royal events. She exhibited as an artist. She raised her sons. She remained married. She remained close to the Queen. There was no reinvention, no brand, no dramatic memoir, no public feud dressed as healing. In a period when celebrity culture was becoming louder, faster, and less patient, Sarah offered almost nothing for it to chew. This may be why people became curious about her in a different way. Mystery survives where publicity starves. Her marriage to Daniel endured with a quietness that made it easy to overlook and harder to dismiss. By royal standards, endurance itself had become notable. The previous decades had trained the public to expect royal marriages to crack under pressure, and often to crack loudly enough to wake the neighbors. Sarah and Daniel did not seem to live that way. They shared artistic interests, a private household, and a preference for life beyond the daily appetite of the press. Their sons grew up with royal connections, but not as headline children. This was not accidental. It was design. Sarah had made a life in which Margaret could be remembered without being repeated. That distinction is the heart of her story. She did not erase her mother. She did not deny the glamour, the pain, or the love. She attended the funerals, helped settle the estate, carried the family history, and remained loyal to the people who mattered. But she did not become the next chapter of Margaret's turbulence. She let the old story end. And perhaps that was the kindest thing she could have done for both of them, because by walking away from Princess Margaret's way of living, Sarah also preserved a better version of Margaret than scandal alone could hold. She kept the taste, the artistic feeling, the sharp intelligence, the loyalty to family, the love of beautiful things. She left behind the chaos, the hunger for attention, the emotional rule by weather. She did not reject the whole inheritance. She edited it. In families like hers, editing is survival. The public still liked to imagine the dramatic scene. A daughter turning from a princess mother, everyone whispering, the palace doors closing. But the truth was quieter and more adult. Sarah walked away over years, in choices so modest they were nearly invisible. A school, a sketchbook, a private romance, a small wedding, a stable marriage, a home for children, visits without surrender, care without self-betrayal, grief without performance, inheritance without spectacle. Everyone knew why, because everyone had seen what happened to those who lived too close to Princess Margaret's flame. Sarah had not escaped by denying the flame existed. She escaped by learning how far away to stand. After the auction, Princess Margaret's life became something the public could hold in its hands. A tiara moved from family memory into a collector's vault. Jewels that had flashed above cigarette smoke and candlelight became entries in catalogues. Furniture that had once sat quietly inside Kensington Palace was examined for condition, history, and value. The woman herself was gone, but her objects continued the performance because beautiful things are stubborn that way. They do not stop shining merely because the person who needed them has disappeared. For Sarah, the sale did not erase her mother. It made the absence more exact. When a parent dies, the first grief is the person. The later grief is the dispersal of the world around them. A coat, a chair, a photograph, a cup that once sat beside the bed. In ordinary families, these things may be packed into boxes by tired relatives in a spare room. In Princess Margaret's family, the boxes were watched by experts, collectors, newspapers, and people with checkbooks large enough to have their own opinions. The scale was grander. The feeling beneath it was not. Sarah did not make that feeling public. She almost never did. That was the habit that had become her signature, though she would probably have disliked the idea of having a signature at all. She did not explain every choice. She did not invite sympathy. She did not offer herself as the injured daughter of a famous mother. Her silence was not empty space. It was a fence, low enough for family, high enough for strangers. By the mid-2000s, this made her unusual in a royal world that was becoming more exposed each year. The old monarchy had survived through distance. The new one was being pushed toward confession, friendliness, access, warmth, and carefully managed intimacy. Television wanted faces, newspapers wanted emotion, magazines wanted homes, dresses, weddings, diets, grief, quarrels, and the exact shade of lipstick worn while having them. The internet was beginning to make curiosity faster and less polite. The palace could still close gates, but the world had learned to climb. Sarah did not climb with it. She appeared when the family required her, then withdrew again. At Trooping the Colour, at weddings, at memorial services, at church gatherings, she could be seen in the royal pattern, composed, neat, present, never straining toward the centre. She was not a woman trying to become more famous. She was a woman trying to remain properly placed. There is a difference, and older royal watchers noticed it. Her art also continued, and that mattered more than many headlines ever understood. Painting was not a decorative sideline to fill the space between royal occasions. It was the serious thread that ran through her adult life. She exhibited work, built a reputation, and pursued a discipline that asked for patience rather than applause. Her subjects often carried restraint, stillness, and a careful attention to ordinary beauty. Flowers, interiors, landscapes, light, arranged objects. The kind of things that can be missed by people who enter rooms looking only for rank. It would have been easy and perhaps profitable for Sarah to make herself more available as the artistic royal daughter of Princess Margaret. She could have traded on memory. She could have wrapped exhibitions in palace anecdote. She could have become a public interpreter of her mother's glamour, a kind of velvet-covered guide to the rooms where the cigarettes were lit and the remarks landed sharply. She did not. The work stood quietly as she did. This was another kind of inheritance settled on her own terms. From Tony, she had inherited the eye. From Margaret, the feeling for beauty. From the Queen, the discipline of not turning every feeling into a scene. The combination gave Sarah a way of living that looked simple only from a distance. It is not simple to take gifts from complicated parents without also carrying forward their damage. It is not simple to honor a mother without obeying her ghost. It is not simple to remain close to royalty without letting royalty become the whole of oneself. Sarah made it look almost ordinary. That was part of the achievement. Her sons, Samuel and Arthur, grew up in that quieter atmosphere. They were not hidden, exactly. Their names belonged to the royal line, and their family ties were too close to pretend otherwise. But they were not fed into the machine as little public figures. They had space to become people before becoming subjects of curiosity. Samuel would grow toward art and making, with an interest in sculpture and craft that echoed the family talent for hands and materials. Arthur would later become more visible in his own way, handsome, athletic, and noticed by a public that has never been shy about noticing a royal young man with good posture. Yet both boys benefited from the life Sarah had built before they arrived. They had grandparents with titles, uncles and cousins in the royal story, ceremonies, ancestral names, and a family tree that could make a school project look like a government archive. But at home, their parents gave them the gift of scale. Royalty was part of life. It was not all of life. There were lessons, family meals, work, friends, growing up, and the ordinary private weather of a household that did not need headlines to feel real. This, perhaps more than anything, showed the distance between Sarah and Margaret. Margaret had adored her children, but her household had been dominated by adult intensity. Her marriage to Tony had been too vivid, too unstable, too full of rival needs and open wounds. Sarah gave her children the opposite lesson. A family did not need to sparkle constantly. It needed to be dependable. The table did not need to be a stage. The mother did not need to be the main event. The father did not need to be a dazzling danger. Peace, properly kept, could be the luxury. It was not the kind of luxury that photographs well. That may be why it was so valuable. The royal family around Sarah kept moving through its own public rearrangements. Charles married Camilla in 2005, a quiet civil ceremony followed by a blessing, bringing into the open a relationship that had once been treated as the great shadow behind Diana's misery. Time had done what time often does in royal families. It had not removed the scandal, but it had exhausted many people's ability to keep shouting about it. Camilla became Duchess of Cornwall, slowly building public acceptance through patience, work, and a refusal to behave as if popularity could be demanded at once. Sarah would have understood that patience. She had seen how cruel public judgment could be, but also how little could be gained by arguing with it every morning. The family survived by moving forward, sometimes gracefully, sometimes as if dragging a heavy trunk across gravel. Charles and Camilla's marriage was not Sarah's story, but it unfolded in the same larger lesson. Royal happiness, when it came at all, often came late and after expensive mistakes. For the Queen, the marriage marked a new stage. Her eldest son had finally settled with the woman he loved, though not without decades of pain around the arrangement. Her family looked less chaotic than it had in the 1990s, but it was not peaceful in the old, unquestioned way. The monarchy now depended not only on duty, but on public tolerance, careful presentation, and the hope that yesterday's scandal would not be tomorrow's documentary. Through all of this, Sarah remained one of the people who did not add weight to the Queen's burden. That quality became more important as the Queen aged. Elizabeth had known drama in every form: national crisis, family rupture, marital embarrassment, press intrusion, death, fire, protest, and the slow erosion of deference. Around her were relatives with demands, advisers with cautions, politicians with red boxes, and a public that wanted both magic and transparency, preferably at the same time, which is a neat trick if one can manage it. Sarah asked for very little. She gave presents instead. Their bond was visible in small ways. Sarah was often near the Queen at family occasions. She was welcomed at Balmoral and Sandringham. She shared the easy familiarity of someone who belonged not by strategy, but by affection. The Queen, famously controlled in public, seemed to soften around certain people, and Sarah was one of them. It was not theatrical. There were no grand gestures, no scenes of royal emotion offered for applause. It was the warmth of a relationship that had been allowed to stay private long enough to become real. The Queen had lost Margaret, but in Sarah there remained something of Margaret made gentler. That is not to say Sarah was a substitute. No niece replaces a sister. Margaret and Elizabeth had shared childhood, parents, war, abdication, the sudden death of their father, and the strange imbalance created when one sister becomes sovereign and the other becomes permanent second. Sarah could not stand in that place, but she carried traces: the artistic feeling, the alertness, the family memory, the connection to Princess Margaret without the turbulence that had so often exhausted everyone. To Elizabeth, this must have been both comforting and bittersweet. Here was Margaret's daughter, proof that the difficult sister had left behind something steady and good. Sarah did not reopen Margaret's wounds. She did not demand the Queen revisit old failures, old indulgences, old rescue attempts. She simply remained, affectionate and calm. For a woman who had spent her life containing other people's storms, that calm was no small gift. As the years passed, the public began to notice Sarah in a different way. Not because she did anything loud, but because she did not. In royal life, steady conduct eventually becomes its own form of mystery. People wondered about the woman who had been Princess Margaret's daughter, who stood close to the Queen, who appeared at great ceremonies without seeming hungry for them, who had remained married to the same man, raised sons largely outside the frenzy, and pursued art with seriousness. She was not a recluse. She was not a rebel. She was something far rarer in that family, a person with boundaries and no need to weaponize them. This made her almost impossible to turn into gossip. The public likes a simple story, and Sarah refused to provide one. She was too royal to be ordinary, too private to be celebrity, too stable to be scandal, too present to be forgotten. She occupied the narrow space that had once been available to minor royals before the modern appetite grew sharper, the space of service, family, private work, and occasional visibility. She protected that space with such consistency that people began to admire not what she revealed, but what she withheld. That withholding was sometimes mistaken for shyness. It may have been partly shyness, but it was more than that. It was knowledge. Sarah knew what happened when a family wound became public property. She knew how a photograph could flatten a life. She knew how strangers could turn a woman into a symbol, then punish her for not living up to the symbol. Her mother had been made into many things: romantic victim, spoiled princess, difficult sister, glamorous rebel, aging scandal, auctioned legend. Sarah had no intention of becoming a symbol if she could remain a person. In 2011, Prince William married Catherine Middleton at Westminster Abbey, and the monarchy entered another season of renewal. The wedding carried obvious echoes: a young prince, a beautiful bride, a nation watching, commentators searching for fairy tale language as if the dictionary had learned nothing since 1981. Yet the tone was different. William had grown up inside the ruin of his parents' marriage and the grief of his mother's death. Catherine entered the family older, steadier, and better prepared than Diana had been. The institution seemed determined to believe it had learned something, which is always encouraging, provided it is true. Sarah attended as family, again near but not central. She would have understood the hope and the danger of such a day. The flowers, the uniforms, the cheering crowds and the balcony kiss, the global audience, all beautiful, all perilous if mistaken for the marriage itself. Sarah's own wedding had been small by royal standards, and its quietness had served her well. William and Catherine's wedding had to be grand because the future required grandeur. But a successful royal marriage is not built on the wedding. It is built afterward, in rooms without trumpets. That was the part Sarah knew best. The years after William's wedding brought a softer public mood for the monarchy. The Queen's Diamond Jubilee in 2012 celebrated 60 years on the throne. There were flotillas, services, concerts, crowds, and the familiar sight of Elizabeth in bright colours standing calmly while the nation congratulated itself for having kept her. Prince Philip, her husband of decades, was increasingly frail but still present, sharp enough to remind everyone that sentiment did not need to become syrup. The family gathered around the Queen as symbol and mother, sovereign and survivor. For Sarah, the Jubilee was not only national ceremony, it was personal history. The Queen had been the fixed point of her entire life. Sarah had been born when Elizabeth had already been on the throne for more than a decade. She had grown up around the sovereign as aunt, watched her through family scandal, depended on her steadiness, and offered quiet affection in return. To see the nation celebrate the Queen's endurance must have carried private meaning. Sarah understood what the public could not fully see. Endurance was not effortless. It was a daily practice, repeated until it looked like nature. Margaret had not been able to live that way. Sarah had. The comparison was not cruel, it was simply true. Margaret had spent much of her life resisting the limits placed upon her. Elizabeth had survived by accepting limits and making duty out of them. Sarah chose a third path. She accepted the limits that protected her, rejected the expectations that would consume her, and built private meaning in the space between. She was royal enough to understand duty, artistic enough to require freedom, and wounded enough to recognize the value of peace. The family needed such people more than it admitted. Every monarchy has its public figures, the ones whose names fill newspapers and whose mistakes become national conversations. But it also relies on quieter members who keep bonds alive, attend the unglamorous occasions, remember birthdays, show up for grief, and do not turn private tensions into public theatre. Sarah belonged to that hidden architecture. She was not a pillar everyone photographed, but she helped keep the roof from feeling empty. As the 2010s moved on, younger generations began to draw the public eye. William and Catherine had children, George in 2013, Charlotte in 2015, Louis in 2018. Prince Harry, long the charming spare with a wounded history of his own, became increasingly central to public fascination. His marriage to Meghan Markle in 2018 brought another wave of hope, attention, argument, symbolism, and pressure. Once again, the royal family found itself presented with a beautiful wedding and the dangerous assumption that ceremony could solve the tensions underneath. Sarah had lived long enough to know better than to trust a carriage ride too much. Harry and Meghan's wedding at St. George's Chapel was warm, emotional, modern, and watched around the world. It also carried the seeds of future conflict, though nobody knew the full shape yet. Different backgrounds, different expectations, an old institution, a ferocious press, private pain, public symbolism. The ingredients were familiar, even if the recipe was new. Sarah appeared, as she often did, with quiet elegance, part of the family but not part of the contest over its future. The years after that wedding grew difficult for the monarchy. Harry and Meghan stepped back from royal duties in 2020, first into negotiation, then into distance, then into an open family rupture played across interviews, statements, and global opinion. The old wounds of spare and heir, duty and freedom, public role and private pain returned in a new form. People took sides eagerly because modern spectators dislike complexity unless it arrives in a costume drama. The royal family, once again, had to absorb a personal fracture as public event. Sarah remained silent. It was not indifference. Silence was her native language in moments when speech would only feed the fire. She had spent her life around spares and sisters, around people damaged by rank and people protected by it, around women punished for wanting more and institutions punished for giving too little. She knew that public explanations often harden positions rather than heal them. Her own life had been built on refusing that route. Then came the loss that changed the Queen's final years. Prince Philip died on April 9, 2021 at Windsor Castle. He was 99. For the public, and his death was the passing of a royal consort, a naval officer, the blunt presence beside the Queen for more than 7 decades. For Elizabeth, it was the loss of the person who had been with her before the crown, during the crown, behind the crown, and often just behind the left shoulder of official photographs looking faintly impatient with ceremony. Their marriage had endured across reign, empire, family scandal, and the small daily aggravations that probably keep any long marriage honest. The funeral was shaped by restrictions from the pandemic, which gave it a spare, almost painful dignity. The Queen sat alone in St. George's Chapel, small in black, masked, separated from the family by rules that made even monarchy obey the same bleak arithmetic as everyone else. It was one of the most haunting images of her reign, not because it was grand, but because it was not. A widow alone with grief, wearing the weight of a crown and the heavier weight of an empty chair. Sarah understood widowhood not from experience, but from family memory. She had seen the Queen Mother after King George VI. She had seen Margaret's life shaped by the loss of that father. She had seen Elizabeth continue through death after death, always standing again when ceremony required it. Now the Queen had lost Philip, and something in the structure of the family shifted. The sovereign remained, but the private brace was gone. In the months that followed, Sarah's quiet closeness to the Queen became more poignant. She was among the relatives who could visit, comfort, and offer companionship without turning sorrow into a project. The Queen did not need fuss. She had endured a lifetime of fuss disguised as service. She needed familiar faces, remembered jokes, shared history, and people who could sit without demanding performance. Sarah could do that. She had been training for it all her life, though nobody would have called it training. A woman raised by Princess Margaret had learned how not to take up too much space. That became a rare grace near the end of Elizabeth's reign. The Queen was increasingly frail. Her public appearances were reduced. Mobility became difficult, and the palace began using careful language about comfort and rest. People who had watched her for decades began looking for signs, studying photographs, noticing walking sticks, cancelled events, brief appearances, and the slight figure who still seemed determined not to let age make a spectacle of her. Sarah would have recognized that determination. It was not the same as Margaret's pride, but it came from the same old royal refusal to be seen as helpless. The family gathered around the Queen in ways the public could only partly see. There were official relatives, working royals, heirs, spouses, grandchildren, great-grandchildren, courtiers, doctors, staff, and the old rhythms of Windsor and Balmoral. But amid the necessary machinery, there were also personal bonds. Sarah was not an heir. She was not a working royal in the central sense. She did not carry the future of the crown. That may have made her presence easier. She came without national consequence attached to every word. For Elizabeth, that must have mattered. The Queen had spent her life surrounded by consequence. Every smile could be read, every phrase interpreted, every delay noticed. Even grief had to pass through duty before it could sit down. Sarah offered something quieter, family without pressure, memory without demand, affection without agenda. She had been the daughter of Elizabeth's most difficult beloved sister, and had somehow grown into one of the gentlest figures in the Queen's private circle. There was a symmetry in that too. Margaret, who had once filled the Queen's life with worry, had left behind a daughter who brought comfort. The younger sister, who had resisted the royal script, had produced a woman who understood the script well enough to step out of it gracefully. The child who had survived Apartment 10 became one of the people trusted near Windsor's fading light. History, for once, had allowed a quieter ending than it usually prefers. Yet Sarah's closeness to the Queen did not undo the central truth of her own story. She had walked away from Margaret's chaos and built a life strong enough to let her return to family without being consumed. She had turned private pain into steadiness, not grievance. She had refused to repeat the old pattern in marriage, motherhood, art, or public life. And now, as the Queen's long reign moved toward its final chapter, Sarah stood not as a damaged daughter trying to escape, but as a grown woman whose escape had become a form of service. The royal family was preparing, though nobody wished to say it plainly, for the end of an age. Elizabeth had been queen for so long that even those who understood mortality treated her as part of the national furniture, a phrase that would have horrified everyone involved, including the furniture. She had outlasted prime ministers, wars, divorces, scandals, jubilees, and the changing moods of a country that loved tradition most when complaining about it. But time was doing its work, quiet and relentless. Sarah had learned from the beginning that beautiful rooms do not stop time, they only give it better lighting. And as the Queen grew smaller within the immense frame of her reign, Sarah remained close enough to see the woman inside the symbol, the aunt inside the monarch, the last great witness to Margaret's childhood and to a world that was nearly gone. The public would soon mourn a sovereign. Sarah would mourn something more intimate and more complicated. The steady figure who had helped show her that a life could be dignified without being dramatic, powerful without being cruel, and private without disappearing. That lesson had saved her long before anyone else understood it. When the end came for Queen Elizabeth, it came in the place where the family had always seemed most like itself. Balmoral was not the monarchy dressed for ceremony. It was the monarchy in tweed, mud, dogs, picnics, river air, and old habits. It was where the Queen could be sovereign and grandmother, head of state and woman with a scarf over her hair, walking through heather under a sky that did not care about protocol. For Sarah, Balmoral had always carried that private royal language. It was the place where formal rank softened just enough for family memory to breathe. On September 8, 2022, Elizabeth died there at the age of 96. The public heard the words and understood history had moved. The family heard them and understood something more intimate had ended. The Queen had been on the throne for 70 years, so long that most people alive in Britain had never known another monarch. But to Sarah, she was not only a national constant. She was the aunt who had watched her grow from the quiet daughter of Princess Margaret into a calm woman of her own making. She was the figure who had shown, not by lectures but by daily conduct, that dignity could be stronger than display. The country mourned a queen. Sarah mourned one of the people who had helped save her from becoming trapped in her mother's shadow. That grief carried layers. There was the public loss, enormous and ceremonial. There was the family loss, smaller in number but deeper in feeling. And then there was Sarah's private loss, tied to a lifetime of comparison between two sisters, Elizabeth, who contained herself for duty, and Margaret, who often could not contain herself at all. Sarah had loved them both. She had learned from both. But she had built her life nearer to Elizabeth's example, not because she lacked feeling, but because she knew too much about what feeling could destroy when allowed to rule the house. In the days after the Queen's death, the old machinery of monarchy began to move with solemn precision. There were statements, flags, bells, uniforms, black clothes, processions, and the strange transformation by which a private body becomes a national event. Elizabeth left Balmoral, travelled through Scotland, then to London, where crowds waited for hours to file past her coffin. People came with flowers, memories, children, medals, walking sticks, and quiet tears. A woman who had spent her life being watched was watched even in death, though now the watching felt less greedy and more grateful. Sarah appeared within that morning not as a public performer but as family. That was always her strength. She knew how to stand inside history without trying to own it. At Westminster Hall and at the funeral, she carried herself with the same composed tenderness people had come to recognize. The face was calm, but calm does not mean unhurt. Often it means the hurt has manners. Around her were the heirs, the children, the grandchildren, the great-grandchildren, the cousins, the soldiers, the clergy, the politicians, the crowned heads, and the world. Sarah stood among them as the daughter of the Queen's late sister, one of the few people whose grief linked the monarch to the old childhood world of Margaret Rose and Lilibet. That childhood world was gone now. King George VI, the Queen Mother, Princess Margaret, Prince Philip, and finally Elizabeth herself had all passed into memory. The family Sarah had known as a child, the older structure of Windsor life, had disappeared one person at a time. This is how dynasties change, not all at once, but through funerals. One chair empty, then another. One familiar voice gone from the table, then another. The portraits remain because portraits are obedient, families are not. King Charles became king immediately, as monarchy requires. There is no pause in the office, and even when the person inheriting it has just lost his mother, this was another lesson Sarah had seen all her life. Feeling must often wait behind continuity. Charles had waited longer than any heir before him. Now in his 70s, he stepped into the role his mother had carried since she was a young woman. The public turned to him with sympathy, curiosity, skepticism, and the usual national habit of hoping for the best while sharpening a pencil. Sarah watched another transition from the side. The side had become her natural place, but never an insignificant one. From the side, she had watched her parents' marriage rise and fall. From the side, she had watched Diana become a myth and then a tragedy. From the side, she had watched the Queen endure, decline, and die. The side is not the same as absence. In families, the person at the side often sees the truth before the people in the centre can bear it. For Sarah, the Queen's death must also have reopened the story of Margaret. Elizabeth had been the last great witness to Margaret as a child, the little sister with the sparkling eyes, the performer, the darling of their father, the girl whose life had not yet been bent by forbidden love, public scandal, and private disappointment. When Elizabeth died, that early Margaret became harder to reach. Sarah could remember her mother, of course, but she had never known that first version. The Queen had. With her went memories no archive could fully preserve. This is one of the secret cruelties of losing older relatives. They take with them versions of the people we loved, and sometimes the versions we most needed to understand. After the funeral, life did what it always does after ceremony. It continued, rather rudely. There were new titles, new arrangements, new portraits, new stamps, new wording, new loyalties spoken aloud. The national anthem changed. The royal household adjusted to a king after 70 years of a queen. Camilla became queen consort, then simply queen in public usage. William and Catherine became Prince and Princess of Wales. The younger generation moved closer to the centre. The old cousins and quieter relatives shifted further into the background, though background in that family can still involve abbeys, carriages, and hats requiring serious engineering. Sarah did not fight the background. She had chosen it long before it was assigned. Her life with Daniel continued with the same steady shape. Their sons were adults now, carrying the family line into a world far different from the one that formed Princess Margaret. Samuel, artistic and private, reflected the family gifts of hand, eye, and quiet concentration. Arthur, more publicly noticed, still belonged to a household that had taught him royalty should not be confused with identity. Sarah had given both sons the chance to stand near history without being devoured by it. That may have been the finest inheritance she could offer, finer than jewels, and much harder to misplace. Then came the coronation. On May 6, 2023, King Charles III was crowned at Westminster Abbey. It was the first British coronation in 70 years, and the ceremony carried the weight of ancient forms adjusted for a modern country that was no longer quite sure what to do with majesty, except photograph it from several angles. Crowns were lifted, oaths were sworn, trumpets sounded, robes moved with deliberate grandeur, and the Abbey became again what it has so often been, a theatre of sacred power, family tension, national symbolism, and very uncomfortable seating. Sarah attended, as she had attended so many defining royal moments. She had seen Charles as a cousin, heir, bridegroom, separated husband, widower in spirit beside Diana, remarried man, aging son, and now king. That long view matters. Public opinion often meets people in chapters. family sees the full manuscript, including the pages everyone would prefer to remove. Sarah belonged to the manuscript. She had known Charles before history called him king, just as she had known Elizabeth behind the word queen and Margaret behind the word princess. At the coronation, Sarah represented continuity of a quieter kind. She was not there to carry the future of the crown. She was not there to launch a new public role. She was not there to be analysed as a power player. She was there because families are made of visible lines and hidden ones, and Princess Margaret's line still mattered. Through Sarah and David, Margaret remained present in the family story. No longer as scandal, no longer as the difficult younger sister, but as ancestry, memory, and blood. This was a gentler form of survival than Margaret had known in life. Margaret had wanted to be seen, admired, and loved in ways that often made life harder for those around her. After death, the most enduring part of her legacy was not the scandal of Moustique or the auction of the Poltimore tiara. It was her children, especially the daughter who had refused to carry forward her chaos. Sarah became the proof that a painful family story does not have to reproduce itself exactly. The pattern can be interrupted, not always loudly. Sometimes by a woman who paints flowers, raises sons, keeps a marriage, attends funerals properly, and leaves before the air turns poisonous. There was no single moment when Sarah walked away from Princess Margaret. That is what made it powerful. It was not one quarrel, not one door, not one unforgivable sentence. It was 1,000 quiet choices, choosing school as a refuge, choosing art as language, choosing Daniel over drama, choosing a wedding that did not pretend to be a national cure, choosing children over public appetite, choosing to care for Margaret in illness without returning to childhood fear, choosing to grieve without performing grief, choosing to sell what had to be sold and keep what could not be catalogued, choosing the Queen as an example of steadiness without becoming cold. Everyone knew why, because everyone had seen what Margaret could demand. That does not mean Margaret was unloved. She was loved deeply, even by people she exhausted, perhaps especially by them, because complicated love often has the strongest roots. She could be generous, hilarious, stylish, and loyal. She could make life feel vivid. She could also make it difficult to breathe. Her wounds were real, but so were the wounds she caused. Sarah's achievement was not that she judged her mother. It was that she understood her and still chose a different life. This is where the story becomes more human than royal. Many families have a Margaret, though usually without the tiaras. A brilliant parent whose moods fill the house. A wounded mother who wants closeness but makes closeness costly. A glamorous figure who can charm the room and frighten the children in the same afternoon. A person whose pain is so large that everyone else learns to step around it, as if pain were furniture. And many families have a Sarah, the quiet child who watches, adapts, withdraws, and later builds a calmer life without making a courtroom out of the past. The royal setting makes the story grand, but the emotional truth is ordinary. Sarah did not escape by becoming hard. That is important. She did not turn herself into stone, or use privacy as a punishment, or pretend she owed nothing to the woman who raised her. She remained tender where tenderness was safe. She remained loyal where loyalty did not require self-erasure. She stayed connected to family rituals, to the Queen, to David, to the wider Windsor circle. She did not burn the bridge. She simply stopped living on the bridge. In the years after the Queen's death, this became easier to see. Sarah appeared at royal occasions with the same calm presence, now part of the older generation herself. The public, more aware of the mental cost of family roles than it had been in Margaret's youth, began to read her quietness with more respect. What earlier eras might have dismissed as shyness looked increasingly like wisdom. In a world where confession had become almost a currency, Sarah's refusal to spend her pain seemed valuable. She had not hidden because she had nothing to say. She had hidden because not everything true must be handed to strangers. That may be the lesson Princess Margaret never fully learned. Margaret had been born into a system that required silence, but she was temperamentally unsuited to silent suffering. She wanted pleasure, romance, beauty, and recognition. She wanted the world to admit what she had been denied. She wanted, perhaps, to be understood without having to become more manageable. That longing made her fascinating and unhappy. It made her a terrible fit for the small, airless role of the Queen's younger sister in a family still traumatized by abdication. She was punished for wanting too much, then indulged because she had been punished, then judged because indulgence did not make her peaceful. Sarah saw the whole circle and stepped outside it. She could do that partly because times had changed, partly because her place was less central, and partly because she had a temperament built for retreat. But temperament alone is not destiny. A quiet person can still become bitter. A wounded daughter can still repeat the wound. Sarah did the harder work of turning retreat into a life, not merely a hiding place. She made privacy productive. She made art from attention. She made marriage from trust. She made motherhood from steadiness. There is a reason her bond with the Queen matters so much in this story. Elizabeth offered Sarah a model of containment that was not chaos. The Queen was not emotionally lavish, but she was reliable. She did not ask the room to manage her feelings. She did not confuse love with constant attendance. She understood duty as a structure, and for Sarah, structure was safer than performance. Margaret had shown Sarah what brilliance looked like when mixed with unmet need. Elizabeth showed her what steadiness looked like when mixed with sacrifice. Sarah borrowed from both, but belonged fully to neither. She did not become a sovereign machine. She did not become a theatrical princess. She became an artist with royal blood, a mother with boundaries, a wife with a quiet marriage, a niece who comforted a queen, and a daughter who survived loving a difficult woman. That is not a small biography. It is simply not the kind that crashes into headlines every morning wearing perfume. If Princess Margaret had been the flame, Sarah was the hand that learned not to reach too close. The old story might have ended with bitterness, a daughter wounded by a famous mother, a mother abandoned by a daughter who could not bear her. But that is too crude, and crude stories rarely survive contact with real families. Sarah did not abandon Margaret. She visited, cared, mourned, inherited, and preserved what could be preserved. She also refused to be consumed. The tenderness and the refusal lived together. That is what made the relationship adult. By the time Sarah stood in the Abbey for Charles' coronation, the girl from apartment 10 had travelled farther than any carriage procession could show. She had passed through scandal, divorce, teenage embarrassment, royal spectacle, artistic training, marriage, motherhood, illness, death, inheritance, national mourning, and the end of the longest reign in British history. She had not done it by winning public battles. She had done it by avoiding battles that did not need to be fought in public. That may sound easy only to people who have never had a family. Princess Margaret wanted life to feel grand enough to justify its disappointments. Sarah wanted life to feel peaceful enough to survive them. That difference explains everything. Margaret had been formed by a royal wound. The abdication that made her father king, the father's early death, the sister's crown, the lost marriage to Peter Townsend, the public collapse of her own marriage, and the slow humiliation of aging after being admired for beauty. She carried those wounds into rooms, sometimes wrapped in jewels, sometimes sharpened into remarks. Sarah was formed by the aftermath, the child watching the adults, the daughter feeling the pressure of a mother's need, the young woman learning that glamour could become a trap, the artist discovering that quiet attention could be a form of freedom. So when people say Lady Sarah Chatto walked away from Princess Margaret, the phrase is true, but only if understood carefully. She walked away from the volatility, not the mother. She walked away from the performance, not the love. She walked away from the idea that a woman must be seen to matter. She walked away from the family habit of turning pain into atmosphere. She walked away from the glittering room where everyone knew how to behave, but nobody knew how to be happy. And she walked toward a smaller, sturdier room of her own. There she painted. There she raised her sons. There she kept her marriage. There she remained close to the aunt who had understood duty and the mother who had suffered under it. There she proved that the most radical royal act can sometimes be a quiet home. The final image of Sarah is not a daughter slamming a door on Princess Margaret. It is far more moving than that. It is a woman closing the door gently after making sure her mother is cared for, after keeping the family bonds that mattered, after refusing the inheritance that would have harmed her, and after carrying forward the parts that were beautiful, the taste, the eye, the intelligence, the love of art, the understanding that life, however privileged, can wound anyone. She left behind the chaos and kept the grace. In a family famous for crowns, Sarah chose proportion. In a family trained for display, she chose privacy. In a family haunted by love stories that became public property, she chose a marriage that remained largely her own. In a family where pain often echoed for generations, she lowered her voice and changed the sound. That is why everyone knew. Not because Sarah accused her mother. Not because Margaret was a monster. Not because the palace whispered some single dramatic secret. Everyone knew because the evidence had been visible for decades. They had seen Princess Margaret burn too brightly and too painfully. They had seen the daughter stand near the flame, warm her hands when she could, then step back before it took her too. And in the end, that step back was not coldness. It was survival. It was mercy. It was the quiet triumph of a woman who understood that walking away can be the most loving thing a daughter ever does, when staying too close would mean disappearing completely.